The door slammed open, before Elena Voss could even sit up from her mat on the floor. Cold air rushed into the small room, carrying with it the smell of rain and the sound of her stepmother's voice, sharp as broken glass. "Get up! Now! You are done here!" Elena blinked into the darkness, her heart already racing before her mind understood why. Clara stood in the doorway, her silk robe wrapped tightly around her, her eyes glowing faintly with the anger of a woman who had waited years for an excuse. Behind her stood Nora and Grace, arms crossed, smiling in a way that made Elena's stomach twist. "What did I do?" Elena asked, her voice still thick with sleep. "You stole from this house," Clara said. "The silver bracelet. My mother's bracelet. It is missing, and you are the only one who would dare." Elena shook her head, scrambling to her feet. "I did not touch it. I swear, I have never even seen it up close." Nora let out a small laugh, the kind that was meant to be heard. "Save your lies for the wolves outside. Maybe they will believe you." Elena's hands trembled as she reached for her shawl, the only warm thing she owned. Clara stepped forward and yanked it from her fingers, before she could even wrap it around her shoulders. "You will not need that where you are going," Clara said. "Tomorrow is the selection. Every pack in this kingdom will send their finest daughters to stand before the Alpha King. And you, thief, will not shame this house by being anywhere near it." Elena felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. "Please," she whispered. "It is freezing outside. Just let me stay until morning." Grace's smile widened. "That is exactly why you should not stay. Let the cold teach you what you deserve." Two of the household guards, men who had never once looked Elena in the eye with kindness, took her by the arms. She did not fight them. She had learned long ago that fighting only made things worse. They dragged her through the narrow hallway, past the kitchen where she had spent countless nights scrubbing pots long after the family had gone to sleep, past the small shrine to her mother that no one else in the house ever visited, and out through the servant's door into the night. The door shut behind her with a sound like a final verdict. Elena stood alone on the stone path, wearing nothing but a thin dress, her bare arms already prickling with cold. The moon hung high above the Ashwood territory, casting pale light over the sleeping village. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, long and low, and Elena wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold in whatever warmth was left in her body. She did not cry. She had cried enough times in that house to know it never helped. Instead, she started walking. She did not know where she was going. The village elders would not take her in, not with Clara's accusation already spreading like fire through dry grass. The pack house was locked at this hour, and even if it were open, the guards there answered to families like Clara's, not to Omegas with no name and no protection. Elena's only living relative had cast her out, and the rest of the world had never cared to notice her at all. She thought of her mother, though the memories were faint and worn soft with time, like old cloth. A woman with copper hair and quiet eyes, who used to hum songs Elena could not remember the words to anymore. Her mother had died when Elena was 6, and ever since, the world had treated her like an inconvenience that refused to disappear. The wind picked up as Elena reached the edge of the village. Ahead of her, the road split in 2 directions. One path led back toward the Omega Quarter, where she might beg for a corner to sleep in. The other path led toward the capital, toward the towering silhouette of the royal palace that could be seen even from here, its spires catching the moonlight like blades. Elena did not know why she chose the second path. Perhaps it was because she had nothing left to lose. Perhaps it was because some small, foolish part of her wanted to see the palace just once, even from a distance, before the selection filled it with girls far more fortunate than her. She walked for hours. Her feet ached first, then went numb. Her thin shoes were not made for long distances, and by the time the village lights disappeared behind her, blisters had already formed on her heels. She passed empty fields, where the crops had long since been harvested, their bare stalks rattling in the wind like small skeletons. She passed a shepherd's hut, dark and silent, and considered knocking, but fear of strangers kept her moving instead. The temperature dropped as the night deepened. Elena's breath came out in small white clouds, and her arms had gone from prickling to a deep, aching cold that settled into her bones. She thought about turning back more than once, but each time she pictured Clara's face, twisted with satisfaction, and she kept walking instead. By the time the palace gates came into view, Elena was barely able to keep her eyes open. The structure rose before her like something from a dream, Tall stone walls wrapped in ivy, iron gates taller than 3 men standing on each other's shoulders, and beyond them, a courtyard lit by torches that flickered orange against the dark sky. Guards stood at their posts near the main entrance, too far away to notice one small figure collapsing against the outer wall. Elena did not plan to fall asleep there. She only meant to rest for a moment, to gather enough strength to find shelter somewhere else before sunrise. She sat down on the cold stone steps just outside the gates, pulling her knees to her chest, trying to conserve whatever warmth remained in her body. The stone was freezing beneath her, but it did not matter anymore. Her eyelids grew heavy, and the sound of the wind became distant, like it belonged to someone else's night. She thought of her mother one last time before the darkness took her. She thought of a warm kitchen that no longer existed, of a voice that used to sing her to sleep, of a home that had been stolen from her long before Clara ever accused her of stealing anything at all. And then Elena Voss, thrown away by the only family she had left, closed her eyes, and slept on the steps of a palace she had never been invited to enter. The cold did not wake her. Nothing did, not for a long while. She did not see the shadow that eventually fell across her, tall and still, studying her, with an expression no one in the palace had seen on that face in a very long time. She did not hear the quiet command given to the guards, or the careful way strong arms lifted her from the freezing stone as if she weighed nothing at all. She only knew, much later, that when she opened her eyes again, the world had changed. But that would come with the morning. For now, there was only sleep, and the small mercy of finally being warm. Hours earlier, before Elena had even begun her long walk through the dark, Damien Ashgrave stood at the window of his private chamber, watching storm clouds gather over the kingdom he was set to rule alone for one more night. Tomorrow the selection would begin, and with it, the end of his freedom. He was the Alpha King of Vermore, a title he had carried since his father's passing 3 years ago, and yet nothing about the crown had ever felt like his own choice. The council had decided long ago that a king needed a queen, that stability required a bride chosen through tradition, through ceremony, through the parade of noble daughters that would soon fill his court like flowers arranged for display. Damien hated flowers arranged for display. He had seen enough of them in his life to know that beauty rarely meant honesty. He turned from the window and paced the length of his chamber, his boots echoing against the marble floor. A fire crackled in the hearth, throwing long shadows across the walls, but even its warmth did nothing to ease the tightness in his chest. Edward, his most trusted advisor, and the man who had served his father before him, had left only an hour ago after another long discussion about the selection candidates. Edward's voice still echoed in Damien's mind, calm and practical as always. The Whitmore girl brings alliance with the Eastern Pax, Your Majesty. The Calloway daughter brings wealth beyond measure. Either would strengthen the kingdom. Damien had said nothing in response, because there was nothing left to say. He understood duty. He had understood it since the day his father died, and left him a crown too heavy for a young man barely into his 20s. But understanding duty did not mean welcoming it, and every conversation about the selection felt less like choosing a partner and more like selecting cargo for the safest voyage. He needed air. Ignoring the guards stationed near his door, who knew better than to question their king's late-night habits, Damien slipped out through a side passage that led to the palace gardens. He often walked there when sleep refused to come, letting the cool night air clear his mind before the demands of morning returned. Tonight, the garden felt different, heavier somehow, as if the sky itself understood what tomorrow would bring. Damien walked past the fountain, past the rows of white roses his mother had planted decades ago, and eventually found himself near the outer wall, close to the main gates. It was not his usual path, but something pulled him that way, some restlessness he could not name. That was when he saw her. At first, he thought it was a trick of the shadows, a pile of discarded cloth left by a careless servant. But as he drew closer, the shape resolved into something unmistakably human, a girl, curled against the cold stone steps just outside the palace gates, her thin dress offering no protection against the night air. Damien's steps quickened without his permission. She was barely breathing when he reached her, her lips tinged with a faint blue, her skin far too cold to the touch. He knelt beside her, his instincts as a wolf sharpening immediately, some ancient part of him recognizing danger before his human mind fully understood it. "Guards!" he called, his voice cutting through the quiet night with an authority that brought 2 men running within seconds. Bring blankets, now, and send for the healer. The guards hesitated only a moment, clearly confused by the sight of their king kneeling beside an unknown girl on the palace steps, but they did not question him. One rushed toward the healer's quarters, while the other returned moments later with thick furs, which Damien immediately wrapped around Elena's small frame. She did not wake, not even as he lifted her carefully into his arms, surprised by how little she weighed, as if the world had already taken more from her than it should have. "Who are you?" he wondered silently, studying her face in the torchlight. Her features were delicate, but marked with exhaustion, her copper hair tangled from wind and travel, her hands rough in a way that spoke of hard work rather than noble privilege. She did not belong to any of the wealthy families expected for tomorrow's selection. That much was obvious. And yet something about her stirred a protectiveness in him he could not explain, an instinct that felt older than reason, deeper than the careful calculations Edward always urged him to make. He carried her through the garden himself, ignoring the surprised glances of servants who happened to be awake at this hour, and brought her to one of the smaller guest chambers near his own wing. He laid her down gently on the bed, pulling the furs higher over her shoulders, and stood there for a long moment, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest. The healer arrived soon after, an older woman named Margaret who had served the royal family for decades, and asked no questions she was not permitted to ask. She checked Elena's pulse, her breathing, the color returning slowly to her lips, and nodded with quiet reassurance. "She will live, Your Majesty. She is exhausted and cold, but strong. Whoever she is, she has survived worse than one night in the frost." Damien said nothing, his eyes still fixed on the sleeping girl. "Shall I send word to the council?" Margaret asked carefully, in the way of someone who understood there were things a king could not always explain. "No," Damien said finally. "Not yet. Let her rest. I will decide what happens next once she wakes." Margaret bowed and left quietly, leaving Damien alone with his thoughts and the soft, steady sound of Elena's breathing. He should have returned to his own chamber. He should have gone back to bed and prepared himself for the exhausting ceremony that awaited him with morning light. Instead, he pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down, watching the stranger who had appeared on his doorstep like something summoned from a fate he had never asked for. Tomorrow, dozens of noble daughters would arrive dressed in silk and jewels, each one polished and prepared to win his favor. And yet here, in the quiet of this small guest chamber, lay a girl in a torn dress, who had nearly frozen to death outside his gates, and Damien found himself more curious about her than he had ever been about any candidate chosen for him by his council. He did not know her name. He did not know where she came from, or why she had been left outside in the cold like something unwanted. But as the first hints of dawn began to touch the horizon outside the window, Damien made a quiet decision that would change everything that followed. Whoever she was, he would not let her disappear back into the darkness she had come from. The fire in the hearth burned low. As the night stretched toward morning, Damien remained in his chair, his sharp golden eyes never quite leaving Elena's sleeping face, his mind turning over questions that had no answers yet. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, the kingdom slept, unaware that the selection meant to decide its future queen had already been changed by a girl no one had invited, and a king who had never expected to care. By the time the sun rose over Vermore, painting the palace towers gold, Elena Voss remained asleep in a bed far softer than anything she had ever known, completely unaware that the Alpha King himself had chosen, without any council's permission, to keep her close. The selection would begin today. But for Elena, the true story was only just beginning, on a night she would later remember as the coldest and, strangely, the most important of her entire life. Elena woke slowly, the way a person wakes from a dream they do not want to leave. Warmth surrounded her, a kind of warmth she had not felt in years, soft blankets pressed against her skin, instead of the thin, worn quilt she used at Clara's house. For a moment, she thought she was still dreaming, that her mind had invented this comfort out of desperation. Then her eyes opened, and she realized the room around her was real. Sunlight poured through tall windows framed with heavy curtains, the color of deep wine. The bed she lay in was larger than any she had ever slept in, its posts carved with patterns of leaves and vines. A fire crackled softly in a stone hearth across the room, and near it sat a chair, empty now, though something about its position told her someone had recently been sitting there. Panic rose in her chest before understanding could catch up. Where was she? How had she gotten here? The last thing she remembered was the cold stone steps outside the palace gates, the wind cutting through her thin dress, her own body giving up the fight against exhaustion. She sat up too quickly, her head spinning, and a soft knock sounded at the door before it opened. An older woman entered, carrying a tray with bread, fruit, and a steaming cup that smelled faintly of herbs. Her expression was calm, almost kind, though her eyes carried the careful neutrality of someone who had spent a lifetime serving people far more powerful than herself. "Good, you are awake," the woman said, setting the tray down on a small table beside the bed. "My name is Margaret. You gave us quite a fright last night." Elena's throat felt dry and rough. "Where am I?"
"You are in the royal palace, child." Margaret's voice remained gentle despite the weight of her words.
"The king found you outside the gates. Another hour in that cold and you might not have woken at all." Elena's stomach dropped. The king. She had heard stories about Alpha King Damian Ashgrave, mostly whispers exchanged among the villagers, tales of a stern ruler who rarely smiled, and carried the weight of his crown like armor rather than privilege. She had never imagined she would end up inside his walls, let alone in a bed clearly meant for someone far more important than an omega thrown out by her own family. "I need to leave," Elena said, pushing the blankets aside despite the ache still lingering in her limbs. "I do not belong here. I should not be here." Margaret placed a firm but gentle hand on her shoulder. "Rest first. Eat something. The king wishes to speak with you when you are ready, and I do not think it wise to keep him waiting in a state of collapse." Elena's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the cup Margaret offered, the warm liquid soothing her raw throat. "Why would the king want to speak with me? I am nobody. I was only sleeping outside his gates because I had nowhere else to go." Margaret studied her for a long moment. Something in her expression softened further, as if she recognized a story she had heard in different forms many times before. "Sometimes, child, the king surprises even those of us who have served him for years. Eat. He will see you soon." True to her word, less than an hour later, Elena found herself standing nervously in a smaller receiving room, dressed in a simple but clean gown that Margaret had provided, her hair brushed and tied back, though nothing could fully erase the exhaustion still clinging to her features. The door opened, and Damian Ashgrave entered. Elena had expected someone intimidating, and in many ways, he was exactly that. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair, and eyes the color of polished gold that seemed to look straight through whatever a person tried to hide. He wore simple dark clothing, nothing like the ornate robes she had imagined a king would wear, yet his presence alone filled the room with an authority that made her want to look away. She did not look away. Something told her that showing weakness now would only make things worse. "You are awake," Damian said, his voice low and even. "That is good." Elena bowed her head slightly, unsure of the correct way to address a king she had never expected to meet. "Thank you for your help, Your Majesty. I did not mean to trouble you or your household. I will leave as soon as I am able." Damian studied her for a long moment before responding. "Sit," he said, gesturing toward a chair near the window. "I have questions, and I imagine you have questions of your own." Elena hesitated before obeying, perching on the edge of the chair as though ready to flee at any moment. Damian remained standing, his arms crossed, his gaze steady but not unkind. "What is your name?" he asked first. "Elena Voss," she answered quietly. "And how did you come to be sleeping outside my gates in the middle of winter, wearing nothing warm enough to survive the night?" Elena's fingers twisted together in her lap. The truth felt humiliating, but lying to a king seemed far more dangerous than admitting the shame of her situation. "My stepmother accused me of stealing something, a bracelet that belonged to her mother. I did not take it, but she did not believe me, or she did not care whether it was true. She threw me out last night, right before the selection. I had nowhere else to go, so I walked, and eventually I could not walk any further." Damian's expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened, a flicker of quiet anger that Elena could not quite place. "And your family did not search for you? They did not try to bring you back once you had gone?" Elena almost laughed, though there was no humor in it. "They were glad to be rid of me, Your Majesty. I have never been anything but a burden to that household since my mother died." "Your mother," Damian repeated, his tone shifting slightly, becoming more careful. "What happened to her?" "She died when I was young," Elena said. "I do not remember much about her, only fragments. She was different from the rest of the pack, I think. People used to whisper about her, though no one ever explained why. Damien's gaze lingered on her for a long moment, as though searching for something hidden beneath her words. Something even she did not fully understand about herself. "Do you know your mother's name?" he asked finally. "Rosalind," Elena answered. "Rosalind Voss, though I have heard some of the older villagers call her by a different name sometimes, though I never understood what they meant by it." Something shifted in Damien's expression, subtle but unmistakable, though he said nothing further on the matter. Instead, he turned toward the window, his hands clasped behind his back, silent for a long moment, as though weighing decisions Elena could not see. "News of you has already spread through the palace," he said eventually. "Servants talk, guards talk. By tomorrow, half the capital will know that a strange girl was found freezing outside the royal gates the night before the selection. People will ask questions. They will wonder why a king concerned himself with a stranger instead of leaving her to the guards or the healers alone." Elena's chest tightened with fear. "I did not ask for any of this, Your Majesty. If my presence causes trouble, I will leave immediately. I do not wish to bring shame upon your household." Damien turned back to face her, his expression unreadable. "That is not what concerns me," he said. "What concerns me is what happens to you once you leave these walls. Your stepmother has already accused you of theft. If you return to your pack now, with no protection and no proof of innocence, what do you imagine will happen to you?" Elena had no answer for that. She had not thought that far ahead, focused only on surviving each moment as it came. Damien studied her for a long moment before speaking again, his voice quieter now, almost hesitant, as though the words surprised even himself as he said them. "There is a way to protect you, and to silence the gossip before it grows into something dangerous," he said. "But it will change your life entirely, and I will not force this upon you without your understanding of what it means." Elena's heart pounded. "What do you mean?" "The selection begins today," Damien said. "Every unmarried woman eligible under pack law may be entered as a candidate. If I enter you as one of them, no one can question why you are here. You would have a place, a purpose, protection under the law of this kingdom, at least until the selection concludes." Elena stared at him, certain she had misheard. "You want me to join the selection? Your Majesty, I am not a noble. I have no family name worth mentioning, no dowry, nothing to offer a king seeking a queen. The other candidates will be daughters of powerful packs, women trained since childhood for exactly this moment. I would only embarrass myself, and perhaps you as well." Damien's jaw tightened slightly, though his voice remained calm. "I did not ask because I believe you must win, Elena. I asked because it is the safest path available to you right now. Whatever happens beyond that is not something either of us can predict." Elena's mind raced, torn between fear and something she could not quite name. A small, fragile spark of hope she had not felt in longer than she could remember. "And if I refuse?" she asked quietly. "Then I will find another way to protect you," Damien said without hesitation. "But I would rather offer you a choice than force a decision upon you, the way others clearly have before." Elena looked down at her hands, thinking of Clara's cold expression, of Nora and Grace's cruel laughter, of the freezing night that had nearly ended her life on stone steps she had never meant to sleep on. She thought of her mother, a woman with secrets no one ever explained, and wondered, for the first time, whether the life she had been given was truly the only path meant for her. "I will do it," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, though it did not waver. "I will enter the selection." Damien nodded once, something unreadable passing behind his golden eyes. "Then let us begin," he said, "and may whatever comes next treat you far more kindly than what came before." Neither of them could have known, in that quiet room with morning light spilling across polished floors, just how much the coming days would test them both, or how deeply the choice made in that single moment would reshape the future of an entire kingdom. The grand hall of the palace had been transformed overnight into something Elena barely recognized as belonging to the same building she had woken up in that morning. Long banners in silver and deep blue hung from the high ceilings, each one bearing the crest of the Ashgrave line, a wolf standing beneath a crown of stars. Rows of chairs lined the polished floor, and at the far end stood a raised platform, where Damien would soon appear to greet the candidates gathered for the first day of the selection. Elena stood near the edge of the hall, dressed in a pale blue gown, Margaret had helped her into that morning, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to hide their trembling. Around her, the dozens of young women whispered and adjusted their jewelry, their confidence radiating from every practiced smile and graceful posture. These were daughters of noble packs, women who had spent years preparing for exactly this moment, and Elena felt smaller with every passing second she stood among them. A familiar voice cut through the noise, and Elena's stomach dropped before she even turned to look. "I do not believe it," Nora said, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and disgust, as she pushed through the crowd toward Elena, Grace following close behind. "What is she doing here?" Grace's expression twisted with something close to fury. "This must be a mistake. She was thrown out. She is nothing but a thief." Whispers rippled outward from the sisters' voices, curious eyes turning toward Elena, who forced herself to stand tall despite the heat rising in her cheeks. She had known this moment would come eventually, but she had not expected it so soon, before the selection had even properly begun. "I am here because the king allowed it," Elena said quietly, though her voice remained steady, despite the fear coiling in her chest. "I have done nothing wrong." Nora's laugh was sharp and cold, drawing even more attention their way. "The king allowed it? Do you truly expect anyone to believe a servant girl caught his eye enough to enter her into a royal selection? You must have lied to him, the same way you lied about the bracelet." "I did not lie," Elena said, holding her ground even as her pulse quickened. "I never took that bracelet, Nora, and you know it." Before the argument could escalate further, a hush fell over the hall as the great doors at the far end opened, and Damien Ashgrave entered, flanked by 2 guards and his advisor Edward, whose sharp eyes swept over the gathered candidates with an expression of careful calculation. Damien's gaze found Elena almost immediately, though his expression remained composed, giving nothing away to the watching crowd. He took his place on the raised platform, and the room fell completely silent, every candidate straightening with renewed focus. "Welcome," Damien said, his voice carrying easily across the vast hall. "Today begins the selection, a tradition older than this palace itself, meant to choose a queen worthy of standing beside the crown. I will not pretend this process is simple, or that every one of you will find what you are hoping for here. But I ask that each of you conduct yourselves with honesty and dignity throughout these coming weeks." His eyes moved briefly across the crowd, pausing for the barest moment on Elena before continuing onward, a gesture so subtle that only those watching closely would have noticed it at all. Unfortunately for Elena, Edward was watching very closely indeed. Later that evening, after the opening ceremony concluded and the candidates were shown to their private chambers within the palace's east wing, Edward requested a private audience with the king, his expression carefully neutral in the way that always meant he had concerns he intended to voice regardless of whether they were welcome. "Your Majesty," Edward began once the door to Damien's study had closed behind them, "may I speak plainly?" "You always do," Damien said, seating himself behind his desk, though his tone carried no real irritation. "The girl you found outside the gates," Edward continued, "Elena Voss. I understand the impulse to protect someone in a moment of crisis, but entering her into the selection carries consequences you may not have fully considered. The council will ask questions. The noble families entering their own daughters will see this as an insult, a servant girl, placed among candidates who have prepared their entire lives for this opportunity." Damien's expression hardened slightly. She was thrown out into the cold by her own family, accused of a crime with no evidence to support it. "Would you have preferred I left her to freeze, rather than risk offending noble sensibilities?" "That is not what I am suggesting," Edward said carefully. "But there are other ways to protect someone without disrupting a tradition this kingdom depends upon for stability. Marriages formed through this selection secure alliances, resources, protection for our borders. A queen chosen from an unknown bloodline offers none of that." Damien's jaw tightened, though he kept his voice level. "I have not chosen anyone yet, Edward. She is simply a candidate now, the same as every other woman in that hall today." Edward studied him for a long moment, something knowing in his expression that made Damien slightly uncomfortable, though he could not have explained why. "Forgive me, Your Majesty, but I have served this family long enough to recognize when something has already shifted, even if the person experiencing it has not yet admitted it to himself." Damien said nothing in response, and after a moment, Edward bowed and excused himself, leaving the king alone with thoughts he was not entirely ready to examine. Meanwhile, In the east wing of the palace, Elena sat alone in her new chamber, smaller and simpler than the noble candidates' rooms, but still finer than anything she had known before. She stared out the window at the darkening sky, replaying the day's events in her mind, the whispers, the cold stares, Nora and Grace's obvious fury at seeing her standing among candidates they believed themselves superior to in every way. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts, and Margaret entered carrying a simple dinner tray, her expression kind as always. "You survived your first day," Margaret said gently, setting the tray down on a small table. "That is more than some manage." Elena managed a tired smile. "Barely. I do not think the other candidates want me here." Margaret's expression softened further as she took a seat across from Elena, her eyes carrying the wisdom of someone who had witnessed many selections come and go over the years. "Most of them do not want each other here either, child. Competition breeds unkindness, especially among those who believe a crown is the only thing worth winning." Elena picked at the food on her tray, her appetite still unsettled from the day's tension. "Do you think the king truly wanted me here, or did he only pity me?" Margaret considered the question carefully before answering. "I have served King Damien since he was a boy, Elena. I have never once seen him act out of pity alone. Whatever his reasons, they run deeper than that, even if he has not fully understood them himself yet." Elena did not know how to respond to that, so instead she simply nodded, letting the quiet comfort of Margaret's presence settle the worst of her nerves, before the older woman eventually rose to leave for the night. Alone again, Elena moved to the window, watching the moon rise over the palace gardens below. Somewhere out there, beyond these walls, Clara and her daughters were likely celebrating the belief that Elena had finally disappeared from their lives for good. They had no idea she now stood, however uncertainly, within the very walls of the kingdom's most powerful house. She thought of her mother again, of the fragments of memory that never quite formed a complete picture, of the strange whispers that had followed Rosalind Voss even in death. Elena did not understand why the king's questions about her mother had felt so pointed, so deliberate, but something told her the answer mattered more than she yet realized. Tomorrow would bring the first official trial of the selection, a test designed to narrow the field of candidates and reveal which among them possessed the qualities necessary to stand beside a king. Elena had no noble training, no wealth, no political alliances to offer. All she had was the truth of who she was, and whatever strength had carried her this far already. It would have to be enough. As she finally climbed into bed that night, exhaustion pulling her toward sleep despite her racing thoughts, Elena could not have known that somewhere across the palace, Damien Ashgrave stood at his own window, thinking of a girl with copper hair and a mother whose name stirred memories he had not expected to surface so soon. Memories tied to an old prophecy his family had guarded in silence for generations. Neither of them slept easily that night, though for very different reasons, and neither of them yet understood how closely their fates had already begun to intertwine. Morning arrived with a chill that reminded Elena of the night she had nearly lost everything, though this time she woke inside walls that offered protection rather than threat. Margaret helped her dress in a simple gray gown suited for the day's activities, explaining that the first trial of the selection would test not beauty or wealth, but character. A series of tasks meant to reveal how each candidate handled pressure, kindness, and unexpected difficulty. The candidates gathered in the palace's lower courtyard, where a woman named Vivian Ashford stood near the front of the group, clearly accustomed to commanding attention. She was the daughter of a powerful Eastern pack, her dark hair styled in elaborate braids, her confidence radiating from every calculated movement. Elena had heard whispers about her the previous evening, how Vivian had already positioned herself as the leading candidate, how she rarely tolerated anyone she perceived as competition. Vivian's sharp eyes found Elena almost immediately, and her lips curled into a smile that held no warmth at all. "So this is the girl found sleeping on the steps like an abandoned dog," Vivian said, loudly enough for others nearby to hear. "I suppose the king felt sorry for you. Do try not to embarrass yourself further today." Elena kept her expression neutral, refusing to give Vivian the satisfaction of a reaction. "I intend only to do my best," she said simply, turning her attention back toward the courtyard, where servants were setting up various stations for the day's trial. The task, announced by a palace official standing near the center of the courtyard, was simple in concept, but revealing in execution. Each candidate would be given a series of small challenges throughout the day, some involving physical tasks, others involving decisions with no clear right answer, all designed to test qualities that could not be taught through wealth or noble birth alone. Elena moved through the morning's trials with quiet determination, drawing on skills she had developed through years of hard labor in Clara's household, skills the other candidates had never needed to learn. When a heavy cart of supplies became stuck in the courtyard mud, Elena was among the first to help push it free, her hands already calloused from years of similar work, while several noble candidates stood back, unwilling to risk soiling their gowns. When an elderly servant stumbled and dropped a basket of bread near the kitchen entrance, Elena knelt immediately to help gather the scattered loaves, speaking softly to reassure the embarrassed woman, while Vivian and several others simply stepped around the mess without a second glance. Damien observed much of the day's proceedings from a distance, standing near the upper balcony alongside Edward, who watched the candidates with the same careful calculation he applied to every political decision. "The Ashford girl handles herself well," Edward observed, nodding toward Vivian as she completed an archery challenge with practiced precision. "Her family's alliance would strengthen our eastern borders considerably." Damien said nothing, his eyes instead following Elena as she helped the elderly servant gather the last of the scattered bread, her expression showing genuine concern rather than performative kindness meant for an audience. She did not know he was watching. That, more than anything else, told him everything he needed to understand about the difference between the candidates below. As the day progressed toward late afternoon, the final trial required each candidate to resolve a staged dispute between two palace workers, testing judgment and fairness under pressure. When it came Elena's turn, she listened carefully to both sides of the invented disagreement, asking thoughtful questions, before offering a solution that satisfied both parties, without favoring either, based on status or appearance. Vivian, when her turn came, dismissed the lower-ranking workers' concerns almost immediately, favoring the more senior servant's position without bothering to fully understand the disagreement, a decision that drew a subtle frown from the officials observing the trial. By evening, as the candidates gathered once more in the grand hall to hear the results of the day's trials, Elena found herself standing near the back of the group, uncertain what to expect. She had not performed for recognition or reward. She had simply acted the way she always had, drawing on instincts shaped by years of hardship rather than privilege. When the official announced that Elena Voss had scored among the highest marks of the day, a ripple of surprised murmurs spread through the hall. Nora and Grace exchanged furious glances near the front of the group, while Vivian's confident smile faltered for just a moment before she composed herself once more. Elena barely had time to process the announcement before Damien's voice cut through the room, calm and measured as always. "Well done to all who competed with honesty today," he said, his eyes briefly meeting Elena's before moving on to address the wider group. "Tomorrow, we will continue the selection process, and I expect each of you to conduct yourselves with the same integrity shown today." That night, as Elena returned to her chamber, exhausted but strangely proud of how the day had unfolded, she found Margaret waiting for her with a warm smile and a fresh pot of tea. "You did well today," Margaret said, pouring 2 cups. "The whole palace is talking about it." Elena accepted the tea gratefully, though worry still lingered beneath her relief. "Vivian will not forgive me for outperforming her. Neither will Nora or Grace." Margaret's expression grew thoughtful. "Jealousy often reveals more about the person feeling it than the person it targets, child. Do not let their bitterness convince you that you do not belong here. You have earned every bit of respect you received today." Elena wanted to believe that, though a quiet unease still settled in her chest as she thought of Vivian's cold eyes, of Nora and Grace's barely concealed fury, of the many ways rivals within these walls might try to undermine her in the days ahead. She had survived one trial, but the selection had only just begun, and something told her the true challenges were still waiting ahead, hidden beneath the polished surface of palace tradition. Elsewhere in the palace, in a private chamber far removed from the noise and gossip of the selection, an older man named Duke Alaric sat alone by candlelight, reading a worn letter he had received earlier that day from a source within the palace staff. His expression darkened as he reached the final lines, his fingers tightening around the fragile paper. "The girl's mother was Rosalind," he murmured to himself, setting the letter aside with careful deliberation. "If that name is truly connected to the old bloodline, then everything we believed settled generations ago may no longer be as buried as we assumed." He rose from his chair and moved toward the window, staring out at the distant lights of the palace, where the selection continued unaware of the storm quietly gathering around it. Whatever ancient secrets the girl carried within her blood, Duke Alaric intended to ensure they remained buried, regardless of the cost required to keep them that way. Unaware of the danger already forming in the shadows around her, Elena drifted towards sleep that night, with a small, fragile sense of hope blooming in her chest for the first time in longer than she could remember, unaware that the very bloodline she barely understood had already begun drawing enemies out of the darkness surrounding the palace she now called home. Days passed, and the selection settled into a rhythm of trials, dinners, and carefully orchestrated events meant to give Damien opportunities to know each candidate beyond first impressions. Elena found herself growing more comfortable within the palace walls, though she remained cautious, aware that comfort could vanish as quickly as it had appeared. One afternoon, as autumn sunlight filtered through the palace library's tall windows, Elena wandered among the shelves, seeking a quiet corner away from the constant scrutiny of the other candidates. She had always loved books, though opportunities to read had been scarce in Clara's household, where her hours were consumed by chores rather than leisure. She did not expect to find Damien there, seated near the far end of the room, a book open in his hands, though his eyes seemed distant, focused on something far beyond the pages before him. "Forgive me, Your Majesty," Elena said quickly, already turning to leave. "I did not mean to intrude." "Stay," Damien said, closing his book and setting it aside. "I could use the company, if you do not mind sharing the quiet." Elena hesitated before settling into a chair a respectful distance away, uncertain how to behave in a moment that felt far less formal than their previous interactions. For a while, neither of them spoke, the comfortable silence settling between them like something neither wanted to disturb. Eventually, Damien broke the quiet himself. "You handled yesterday's trial well," he said. "The other candidates struggled with the dispute resolution task, but you seemed to understand instinctively how to weigh both sides fairly." Elena considered his words carefully before responding. "I suppose I learned early that most disagreements come from people who feel unheard," she said. "Listening properly usually solves more than people expect." Damien studied her with quiet interest. "That is not a skill most nobles bother developing. They are usually taught to speak, not to listen." Elena allowed herself a small, tired smile. "I was never given much choice in what I needed to learn, Your Majesty. Survival tends to teach lessons nobility often overlooks." Something shifted in Damien's expression, a flicker of understanding that went deeper than polite curiosity. He leaned forward slightly, his golden eyes studying her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, though not entirely from fear this time. "Tell me about your mother," he said gently. "Not the fragments you have already shared, but anything else you remember, however small it may seem." Elena's brow furrowed slightly at the request, uncertain why her mother's memory seemed to matter so much to him. "I remember her singing sometimes, though I cannot recall the words anymore. I remember she kept a small wooden box hidden beneath the floorboards of our old cottage, though I never saw what was inside it. After she died, the box disappeared, along with everything else that once belonged to her." Damien's expression grew thoughtful, almost troubled, though he masked it quickly enough that Elena nearly missed it entirely. "Did she ever speak of the old pacts?" he asked carefully. "Of bloodlines older than the current ruling families?" Elena shook her head slowly. "Not that I remember. Why do you ask, Your Majesty? Does something about my mother concern you?" Damien hesitated, clearly weighing how much to reveal. "There are old stories within my family," he said finally, "of a bloodline believed lost generations ago, one connected to abilities beyond ordinary wolves. I do not yet know if the stories connect to you, but something about your presence here feels significant in ways I am still trying to understand." Elena did not know how to respond to that, unsettled by the idea that her mother's death might carry secrets far larger than she had ever imagined. Before she could ask further questions, however, the library door opened, and Edward entered, his expression carrying the familiar weight of urgent palace business. "Your Majesty," Edward said, glancing briefly at Elena, before addressing Damien directly. "The council requests your presence regarding tomorrow's trial arrangements." Damien rose reluctantly, offering Elena a brief nod, before following Edward from the room, leaving her alone once more among the quiet shelves, her mind now filled with questions she had never thought to ask before. That evening, in a private chamber far from the library's calm atmosphere, Vivian Ashford sat with two of her closest allies among the candidates, their expressions sharp with calculated frustration. "She cannot continue outperforming us," Vivian said, her voice low and controlled, despite the anger simmering beneath it. "Tomorrow's trial involves the training grounds. If she truly has no proper upbringing, she will struggle far more than the rest of us during physical combat demonstrations. We simply need to ensure her struggle becomes impossible to ignore." One of her allies, a quiet girl named Priscilla, frowned slightly. "What do you have in mind?" Vivian's smile turned cold. "Nothing dangerous, of course. Merely an unfortunate accident during the demonstration, enough to expose whatever weaknesses she has been hiding beneath that carefully composed exterior." The following morning, the candidates gathered at the palace's training grounds, where instructors explained the day's trial would involve basic combat demonstrations, meant to test discipline and control, rather than actual fighting skill. Wooden practice weapons were distributed, and candidates were paired according to a schedule determined the previous night. Elena found herself paired against Vivian, a pairing she suspected was no accident given the calculating look in Vivian's eyes as they faced each other across the training circle. "Try not to embarrass yourself too badly," Vivian said quietly, twirling her practice sword with practiced ease, "though I suppose some embarrassment is inevitable for someone raised scrubbing floors instead of learning proper technique." Elena said nothing, focusing instead on the instructor's signal to begin. She had never held a sword before, her only physical training coming from years of hard labor rather than formal combat instruction. But she moved with quiet determination, blocking Vivian's initial strikes with more instinct than skill. The match continued for several minutes, drawing attention from other candidates and instructors alike, until Vivian, growing frustrated at Elena's unexpected resilience, executed a strike far harder than the training exercise called for, aimed not at Elena's practice weapon, but directly toward her shoulder. Elena's instincts took over before conscious thought could intervene. Something deep within her responded to the incoming danger, a surge of energy she had never felt before rushing through her limbs, and in the span of a single heartbeat, her eyes flashed with a golden light, unlike anything the gathered crowd had ever witnessed among ordinary wolves. The training circle fell utterly silent. Vivian's practice weapon clattered to the ground as she stumbled backward, her expression shifting from calculated cruelty to genuine shock. Around them, instructors and candidates alike stared at Elena with a mixture of confusion and something closer to awe, murmurs already beginning to spread through the gathered crowd. "What was that?" someone whispered nearby, though Elena barely registered the question, her own confusion far greater than anyone else's as she stared down at her trembling hands, the strange golden light already fading from her eyes as quickly as it had appeared. Word of the incident reached Damien within the hour, delivered by a visibly shaken instructor who struggled to describe what he had witnessed in the training circle. Damien listened carefully, his expression revealing little of the recognition stirring within him, though his mind immediately connected the instructor's description to old stories his grandfather had once shared, stories of an ancient bloodline capable of abilities modern wolves had long since forgotten. He found Elena alone in her chamber shortly after, still shaken from the incident, Margaret sitting beside her offering quiet reassurance that did little to calm the confusion evident on Elena's face. "Your Majesty," Elena said as Damien entered, rising quickly despite her obvious distress. "I do not know what happened. I have never experienced anything like that before in my life." Damien gestured for her to sit again, his expression calm despite the significance of what he now suspected. "I believe I may understand more than you realize," he said carefully. "Tell me, did your mother ever show similar signs, moments of unexplained strength or unusual ability?" Elena's brow furrowed as she searched her fragmented memories. "There were times," she admitted slowly, "moments when villagers whispered about her differently than they did other Omegas, though I never understood what they meant. She never explained it to me. I was too young, and then she was gone before I could ever ask." Damien's expression grew serious, though not unkind. "I believe your mother may have descended from a bloodline my family has spoken of only in old stories, one connected to the earliest founding packs of this kingdom, a lineage believed extinct for generations. If that is true, Elena, then what happened today was not an accident or a strange occurrence. It may be the awakening of an ability that has been dormant within you your entire life." Elena stared at him, overwhelmed by the weight of his words. "What does that mean for me now?" Damien's gaze softened, though the concern in his expression remained. It means, he said quietly, that you may be far more important to this kingdom than either of us initially understood, and it means we must be far more careful about who learns of what happened today, because not everyone will react to that truth with curiosity alone. Elena did not yet understand the full danger contained within his warning, but the seriousness in his eyes left no doubt that whatever had awakened within her that day had changed everything, not only for her uncertain place within the selection, but for the future of the kingdom itself. News of the training ground incident spread through the palace faster than any announcement the council could have made intentionally. By the following morning, servants whispered about it in hallways. Candidates exchanged nervous glances whenever Elena walked past, and even the guards seemed to regard her with a wary curiosity they had not shown before. Duke Alaric received the news with far greater interest than most, though he was careful to keep his reaction hidden from those around him. He had suspected, ever since reading the letter naming Rosalind as Elena's mother, that the girl might carry abilities tied to the old bloodline his family had worked for generations to keep buried. Now he had confirmation, delivered not through careful investigation, but through Vivian's own reckless attempt to humiliate a rival. He summoned Vivian to a private meeting that evening, choosing a quiet corner of the palace gardens where their conversation would not easily be overheard. "You saw what happened yesterday," Duke Alaric said without preamble once Vivian arrived, her expression still carrying traces of the shock she had experienced during the training incident. "I saw something I cannot explain," Vivian admitted, her usual confidence noticeably shaken. Her eyes, they glowed like nothing I have ever witnessed among ordinary wolves. Duke Alaric nodded slowly, satisfaction hidden carefully beneath his composed exterior. "What you witnessed, child, was the awakening of a bloodline this kingdom believed extinct generations ago, one connected to abilities the founding families considered too dangerous to allow near the throne. If the girl truly carries that lineage, she poses a threat far greater than simple competition within your selection." Vivian's eyes narrowed with renewed interest, her earlier fear giving way to calculation. What kind of threat? "The old stories speak of abilities capable of challenging even a king's authority," Duke Alaric explained carefully, choosing his words to plant exactly the seeds of concern he intended. If she were to become queen, and if her bloodline's full potential were to awaken completely, the balance of power within this kingdom could shift in ways none of us can predict or control. Vivian's expression hardened with renewed determination. Then she cannot be allowed to remain in the selection. Duke Alaric allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. "I am glad we understand each other. However, removing her carelessly would only draw suspicion, especially given the king's apparent interest in her well-being. We must be patient, and we must ensure that when she falls, it appears to be entirely her own doing, or the natural consequence of dangers she herself invited." "What do you suggest?" Vivian asked, her earlier fear now fully replaced by cold ambition. "Leave that to me," Duke Alaric said. "For now, simply continue observing her, and report anything unusual you witness. The right opportunity will present itself soon enough." Unaware of the conspiracy quietly forming against her, Elena spent the following days attempting to return to some sense of normalcy within the selection, though the whispers and stares following her every movement made that increasingly difficult. Margaret remained a steady source of comfort, offering quiet reassurance whenever Elena's confidence wavered, while Damien made a point of checking on her privately each evening, their conversations gradually deepening beyond formal discussions of the selection's requirements. One evening, nearly 2 weeks into the selection, Damien invited Elena to join him for a private dinner, within a smaller chamber removed from the noise and formality of the grand hall. Elena arrived nervously, uncertain what to expect, though she found the atmosphere surprisingly relaxed, free from the watchful eyes of council members or rival candidates. "I hope this is not improper," Damien said, as they settled at a small table set with simple, elegant dishes. "I find myself tired of formal dinners, surrounded by people more interested in impressing me than simply speaking honestly." Elena allowed herself a small smile, some of her usual caution easing in the quiet privacy of the room. "I imagine that grows exhausting, always wondering who speaks from genuine feeling and who speaks only from ambition." "You understand that better than most," Damien observed, studying her with quiet appreciation. "You have never once tried to flatter me or manipulate my opinion since the night we met." Elena considered his words carefully before responding. "I suppose I never learned the skill of flattery, Your Majesty. Where I come from, Honesty was often the only thing I had left to offer, even when it cost me comfort or safety. Damien's expression grew thoughtful, something warm settling behind his golden eyes that Elena had not seen directed toward her before. That honesty is precisely what I find myself valuing most, he admitted quietly. More than wealth, more than political alliance, more than anything else this selection was designed to measure. Elena's heart quickened at his words, uncertain how to respond to an admission that felt far more personal than anything exchanged between them before. Your Majesty, she began carefully, I do not wish to presume anything about your intentions. I understand the selection carries expectations far beyond simple honesty. Political alliances, noble bloodlines, the security of your borders. I cannot offer any of that. Damien reached across the table, though he stopped short of touching her hand, his expression suddenly serious. Elena, he said, using her name without title, for perhaps the first time since they had met. I did not enter you into this selection out of pity, and I have not continued observing your progress out of mere curiosity. Whatever this kingdom expects from its future queen, I find myself increasingly certain that expectations built on wealth and alliance alone have never truly served this crown well. Elena's breath caught slightly at the sincerity in his voice, though caution still lingered beneath her growing hope. And what does your council expect? She asked quietly. What does Edward believe would serve this kingdom best? Damien's expression tightened slightly at the mention of his advisor's concerns. Edward believes duty and personal feeling exist in separate categories, he admitted. He is not wrong that alliances matter for this kingdom's stability. But I am growing increasingly certain that a queen chosen purely for political convenience offers this kingdom far less than one chosen for genuine character and strength. Their conversation continued long into the evening, touching on subjects far removed from formal selection requirements. From childhood memories to quiet hopes, neither had shared with anyone else. By the time Elena finally returned to her chamber that night, her heart felt lighter than it had in longer than she could remember, though the underlying uncertainty of her situation remained. She did not know, as she drifted toward sleep, that Duke Alaric had already begun setting careful plans into motion. Plans that would test not only her growing bond with Damien, but her very survival within the palace walls. She had begun, cautiously, to consider something close to home. 3 days later, an official announcement spread through the palace, informing candidates that the selection's next major trial would involve a formal hunting exercise within the royal forest, a tradition meant to test both physical capability and the ability to remain calm under the pressure of nature's unpredictability. Duke Alaric, upon learning of the exercise's location and timing, felt a cold satisfaction settle over him, already calculating how the dense, unfamiliar terrain of the royal forest might provide exactly the opportunity he had been waiting for. The morning of the forest trial arrived beneath a sky heavy with gray clouds, though the palace officials assured the gathered candidates that a little weather would only make the exercise more meaningful. Elena stood among the group at the forest's edge, dressed in practical clothing suited for the trial ahead, her nerves settling somewhat, as she reminded herself that whatever challenges awaited, she had already survived far worse than an autumn walk through unfamiliar woods. The exercise required each candidate to navigate a marked section of the royal forest alone, following a trail of ribbons tied to trees, collecting small tokens hidden along the path to prove they had completed the route correctly. Instructors would remain stationed at intervals to ensure safety, though the candidates were expected to rely on their own judgment and composure throughout the exercise. Elena set off along her assigned path with cautious determination, the forest's quiet broken only by the rustle of leaves and distant birdsong. She found the first 2 tokens without difficulty, tucked beneath the roots of an old oak tree and hidden within a hollow log, exactly where the instructions indicated they would be. She did not notice, as she continued along the marked trail, that someone had quietly moved several of the ribbon markers earlier that morning, redirecting her path away from the safe route and toward a section of the forest the instructors had specifically warned candidates to avoid, an area near the steep ravine that marked the forest's natural boundary. By the time Elena realized something felt wrong, the familiar ribbons had disappeared entirely, replaced by unfamiliar terrain and the growing sound of rushing water somewhere ahead. The gray sky above had darkened further, and a light rain had begun to fall, making the ground beneath her feet increasingly slick and uncertain. She paused, uncertain whether to continue forward or attempt to retrace her steps, when the ground near the ravine's edge suddenly gave way beneath her, loosened by the rain and years of erosion the instructors had not accounted for when planning the trial's boundaries. Elena managed to catch herself on an exposed root just before falling completely, her feet dangling precariously over the steep drop below, the sound of rushing water now uncomfortably close. "Help!" she called out, her voice carrying only a short distance through the dense trees, though she continued calling regardless, her arms already beginning to ache from the strain of holding her position. Damien, who had been observing portions of the trial from a discreet distance alongside a small group of guards, felt an inexplicable unease settle over him nearly an hour into the exercise, an instinct he could not entirely explain but had learned never to ignore. He excused himself from the observation point and began moving through the forest with quickening steps, some part of him already sensing that something had gone wrong. He found the displaced ribbon markers first, immediately recognizing they had been deliberately moved rather than simply damaged by weather, and his pace increased further as understanding settled cold and heavy in his chest. Following the altered path, he soon heard Elena's faint calls for help carrying through the rain, and he broke into a full run toward the sound. He reached the ravine's edge, just as Elena's grip on the exposed root began to weaken, her arms trembling from the sustained effort of holding herself in place. Without hesitation, Damien dropped to his knees at the edge and reached down, his strong hand closing around her wrist with a firm, steady grip. "I have you," he said, his voice calm, despite the urgency of the situation. "Do not let go." Elena's fingers ached, but she held on, trusting the steady strength in Damien's grip as he pulled her carefully upward, away from the dangerous drop below. Once she was safely back on solid ground, he pulled her fully into his arms, both of them breathing heavily from the tension of the moment, rain soaking through their clothes as they knelt together on the forest floor. "Are you hurt?" Damien asked, pulling back just enough to study her face, his expression carrying a depth of concern that went far beyond formal duty. "I do not think so," Elena said, though her voice trembled slightly from the lingering shock of the near fall. The ribbons were moved. "I followed the path exactly as instructed, but the markers led somewhere they should not have." Damien's expression darkened with quiet anger, though he kept his voice gentle for Elena's sake. "Someone did this deliberately," he said. "This was no accident of weather or careless preparation." Elena's eyes widened slightly as the implication settled over her. "You believe someone tried to hurt me. I believe someone wanted you removed from this selection by whatever means necessary," Damien said grimly, rising to his feet and helping Elena up alongside him. "And I intend to discover exactly who is responsible." He wrapped his own cloak around her shoulders against the rain and guided her carefully back toward the safer, marked trail, his arm remaining protectively around her the entire way, neither of them speaking further until they reached the forest's edge, where concerned guards and instructors had already begun organizing a search after noticing Elena's prolonged absence. The remainder of that day passed in a blur of careful questioning and quiet investigation, though no immediate culprit was identified, the displaced ribbons offering no obvious clue as to who had moved them or why. Elena remained shaken by the experience, though Margaret's gentle care that evening helped steady her nerves considerably, along with the knowledge that Damien had personally assigned additional guards to watch over her chamber through the night. Word of the incident reached Vivian later that evening through a hurried, anxious message from Duke Alaric, warning her to distance herself immediately from any suspicion regarding the ravine's proximity to the trial's marked path. Vivian, genuinely frightened by how close the plan had come to causing real harm rather than simple embarrassment, began to question for the first time whether her alliance with the Duke had led her somewhere far more dangerous than she had originally intended. Meanwhile, within the quiet privacy of his own study, Damien sat troubled long into the night, turning over the day's events with growing certainty that whatever threat Elena's bloodline represented to certain factions within his kingdom, it had already begun manifesting in ways that placed her life in genuine danger. He resolved, as the fire in his hearth burned low, to uncover the truth behind the incident, regardless of what political consequences that investigation might eventually reveal. Elena, meanwhile, lay awake in her own chamber, long after Margaret had finally retired for the night, replaying the moment Damien's hand had closed around her wrist, pulling her back from danger, with a strength and certainty that had nothing to do with duty or political obligation. Whatever the coming days revealed about the danger surrounding her, she found herself increasingly certain that she no longer faced it entirely alone, and that realization alone offered more comfort than she had felt in longer than she could remember. The investigation into the ravine incident continued quietly over the following days, led personally by Edward at Damien's insistence, though the advisor's initial skepticism regarding Elena had softened considerably once he understood the deliberate nature of the danger she had faced. Guards questioned instructors, examined the displaced ribbon markers for any identifying detail, and gradually pieced together a timeline suggesting the sabotage had occurred sometime before dawn on the morning of the trial. Vivian, increasingly troubled by guilt she had not expected to feel so strongly, found herself unable to sleep properly in the days following the incident. She had wanted Elena embarrassed, perhaps even removed from the selection through simple failure, but she had never intended for anyone to face genuine danger, and the memory of how close Elena had come to serious harm weighed on her conscience more heavily with each passing day. Late one evening, unable to bear the weight of her silence any longer, Vivian requested a private audience with Edward, her hands trembling slightly as she was shown into a small meeting room within the palace's administrative wing. "I need to tell you something," Vivian said before Edward could even offer a formal greeting, her voice shaking with barely controlled emotion. "About the forest trial. About what happened to Elena." Edward's expression sharpened immediately, though he kept his tone carefully measured. "I am listening." Vivian explained everything, her voice growing steadier as the confession poured out of her. The conversation with Duke Alaric, his warnings about Elena's bloodline, the plan to move the ribbon markers toward the dangerous section of forest near the ravine. She had not expected the ground to give way so severely, she insisted, tears finally spilling over as the full weight of what nearly happened settled over her completely. "I never wanted her hurt," Vivian said, her earlier composure completely gone now. "I only wanted her gone from the selection. I did not understand how dangerous the Duke's intentions truly were until it was almost too late." Edward listened carefully, his mind already working through the political implications of what Vivian had revealed. Duke Alaric's involvement suggested a threat far larger than simple rivalry between selection candidates, one connected to old family concerns about bloodlines and power that Edward himself had only heard referenced in the most guarded historical records maintained by the Crown. "You will need to repeat this account before the king," Edward said finally, his tone firm but not unkind, "and you should understand that whatever consequences follow from your involvement, your honesty tonight will be remembered favorably, compared to continued silence." Vivian nodded miserably, accepting the necessity of what came next, even as fear of Duke Alaric's potential retaliation settled uneasily in her chest. The following morning, Damien summoned both Vivian and Duke Alaric to a private council session, though the Duke arrived with no indication that he suspected his plans had already unraveled. Vivian's trembling account, delivered before the assembled council members, left little room for Duke Alaric to maintain his composed denial once Edward presented the physical evidence gathered from the displaced ribbon markers, alongside testimony from several palace staff members who confirmed suspicious activity near the forest trail before dawn on the morning in question. "This is absurd," Duke Alaric protested, though his voice carried less conviction than his words suggested. "I have served this crown faithfully for decades. Why would I concern myself with some servant girl entered into the selection on a whim?" "Because she is not simply some servant girl," Damien said, his voice cold with barely restrained anger. "Because her bloodline connects to something your family has apparently spent generations working to keep buried, and because you were willing to risk her life rather than allow the truth of that connection to surface naturally." Duke Alaric's expression faltered slightly, the calculated composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of evidence he could no longer easily dismiss. "You do not understand what you are protecting," the Duke said finally, his voice low and urgent. "The old bloodline was sealed away generations ago for good reason. Abilities like the ones that girl now carries once brought this kingdom to the edge of ruin, before the founding families agreed to suppress that lineage permanently, for the safety of everyone within these borders." "Then explain it to me properly," Damien said, his tone unwavering. "Rather than attempting to eliminate an innocent woman through cowardly sabotage, you might have simply brought your concerns before me honestly." Duke Alaric said nothing further, understanding finally that whatever justification he might offer, his actions had already condemned him beyond any reasonable defense. The council, following brief deliberation, ordered the Duke's removal from his position, and confined him to house arrest within his own estate, pending further investigation into the full extent of his activities against the crown. With the immediate danger addressed, though not entirely resolved, Damien turned his attention toward understanding the deeper truth behind Duke Alaric's warnings. He summoned Aldrich Fenwick, an elderly scholar who maintained the palace's most ancient historical records, requesting a thorough review of anything documented regarding the old bloodline the Duke had referenced. Scholar Fenwick arrived within the hour, a thin man with silver hair and careful, methodical movements, carrying with him a heavy leather-bound volume that had clearly not been opened in many years. "Your Majesty," the scholar said, settling the ancient book carefully onto Damien's desk, "what you are asking about touches one of the oldest and most carefully guarded stories within our kingdom's history. Please, explain," Damien said, gesturing for the scholar to continue. "Generations ago, before the current ruling families established their authority, this land was governed by an ancient lineage known simply as the First Blood," Fenwick explained, carefully turning the fragile pages of the old volume. "They possessed abilities beyond ordinary wolves, strength and instinct connected directly to the land itself. According to these records, a great conflict eventually arose between the First Blood and the founding families who sought to establish more traditional rule, resulting in the lineage being scattered and largely hidden to prevent further conflict." "And you believe Elena descends from this lineage?" Damien asked. "The evidence certainly suggests it," Fenwick said, turning to a specific page containing an old illustration depicting eyes glowing with golden light, remarkably similar to what witnesses described during the training ground incident. The records here specifically describe this exact manifestation as a defining characteristic of the First Blood lineage, awakening typically during moments of genuine danger or emotional intensity. Damien studied the illustration carefully, understanding settling over him with quiet certainty. "And the prophecy Duke Alaric referenced," he asked, "is there truth to his fears about the lineage bringing danger to this kingdom?" Fenwick considered the question carefully before answering. "The old records suggest the opposite, Your Majesty," he said finally. "According to the most complete account preserved here, the First Blood lineage was never inherently dangerous. The conflict generations ago arose from fear and misunderstanding, rather than any genuine threat posed by the bloodline itself. In fact, several passages suggest that should the lineage ever return to stand beside a rightful ruler rather than against one, it was foretold to bring unprecedented strength and stability to the kingdom, not ruin." Damien absorbed this information carefully, a quiet resolve settling over him as pieces of understanding finally clicked into place. "Thank you, Scholar Fenwick," he said. "This information changes a great deal." Later that evening, Damien sought out Elena, finding her in the palace gardens where she often retreated during quiet moments, away from the selection's constant scrutiny. He explained everything Scholar Fenwick had shared, watching carefully as she processed the revelation that her mother's mysterious lineage connected directly to one of the oldest and most significant bloodlines in the kingdom's history. "So the abilities I showed during the training incident," Elena said slowly, working through the implications, "they are not something to fear. According to the oldest records available to us, no," Damien said gently. "If anything, they represent something this kingdom once believed capable of bringing tremendous strength, should the bloodline ever choose to stand alongside rightful leadership rather than against it." Elena absorbed this quietly, the weight of her mother's hidden legacy settling over her with a mixture of wonder and lingering uncertainty. "And what happens now?" she asked, meeting Damien's steady gaze. "Now that the truth is known." "Now," Damien said, stepping closer, his voice carrying quiet certainty, "we finish the selection, and I make the choice I have already known in my heart for some time, regardless of what politics or old fears might have once suggested otherwise." Elena's breath caught at the meaning behind his words, hope and uncertainty mingling together as she searched his expression for confirmation of what she barely dared to believe he meant. Neither of them spoke further that evening, though something had shifted permanently between them, a quiet understanding neither needed words to confirm. Yet even with Duke Alaric's plot exposed, and the truth of Elena's lineage finally understood, one final challenge remained before the selection could reach its conclusion. A confrontation neither Elena nor Damien could have fully anticipated, arriving from a source far closer to Elena's own past than either of them expected. In the days following the revelation of her lineage, Elena found herself facing a new kind of challenge, one far removed from the trials and rivalries of the selection itself. The strange golden light that had flashed briefly during the training ground incident remained largely a mystery to her, an ability she had no understanding of how to summon or control, and the uncertainty of not knowing when it might surface again left her feeling unsettled in ways the ordinary pressures of the selection never had. Damien, sensing her unease, arranged for her to receive guidance from an unlikely source, an elderly wolf named Griselda, who lived quietly at the edge of the royal forest, rumored among the older palace staff to carry distant knowledge of the ancient bloodlines, long since scattered across the kingdom. Elena traveled to meet her one crisp morning, accompanied only by Margaret and a small escort of guards, uncertain what to expect from someone the years had apparently forgotten to visit with any regularity. Griselda's small cottage sat nestled among towering oaks, smoke curling gently from its chimney, and the old woman herself greeted Elena with sharp, knowing eyes that seemed to see far more than her weathered face initially suggested. "So you are the one," Griselda said without preamble, studying Elena carefully as she gestured for her to sit near the modest hearth. "The first blood, awakened after all these years of quiet sleep." "I do not understand what that means," Elena admitted honestly. "I only know something happened within me that I cannot explain or control." Griselda's expression softened slightly at the admission. "Control comes with understanding, child, not with fear. The ability you carry responds to instinct and emotion, particularly moments of genuine threat or deep feeling. It is not a weapon to be commanded at will, not yet, perhaps not ever entirely. It is closer to a part of yourself you must learn to recognize and trust, the way you might learn to trust your own heartbeat." During one of her early visits, Griselda mentioned something that caught Elena entirely by surprise, an offhand remark about a small wooden box the old woman had once been asked to safeguard for a young mother, traveling through the forest many years earlier. A woman whose description matched fragments of Elena's own distant memories of Rosalind. "The wooden box," Elena repeated, her heart quickening. "My mother kept something like that hidden beneath the floorboards of our cottage. It disappeared after she died." Griselda studied her carefully, before rising slowly and moving toward a small chest tucked in the corner of her cottage, retrieving from within it a modest wooden box, its surface worn smooth with age, carved with a simple pattern of intertwining vines that Elena recognized immediately from memories she had believed lost forever. "Your mother came to me many years ago, frightened and uncertain," Griselda explained, placing the box gently into Elena's trembling hands. "She said she carried something that needed protecting, something too dangerous to keep within reach of those who might misunderstand its significance. I promised her I would keep it safe until the right person came to claim it, though I confess I had begun to wonder, as the years passed, whether that day would ever arrive." Elena opened the box carefully, finding within it a simple silver pendant shaped like a small crescent moon, alongside a folded letter, written in handwriting she recognized instantly, faded, but still legible after so many years. "My dearest Elena," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then the day I always feared has finally come, and I am no longer present to explain everything myself. Know that the blood you carry is not a curse, whatever others may have told you or made you believe. It is a gift passed down through generations of women, who chose kindness and courage, even when the world offered them every reason to choose otherwise. Wear this pendant when you finally understand who you truly are, and know that wherever I am, I remain proud beyond measure of the woman I always believed you would become." Elena's tears fell freely as she finished reading, the weight of her mother's love reaching across the years to find her exactly when she needed it most. Griselda watched with quiet understanding, having witnessed enough of life's sorrows and reunions to recognize the significance of the moment unfolding before her. "She loved you very much," Griselda said softly. "I could see it clearly, even in the brief time I knew her." Elena carefully fastened the pendant around her neck, feeling a warmth settle over her that had nothing to do with the modest fire crackling in Griselda's hearth. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "for keeping this safe all these years, waiting for a day you were never certain would come." "It was my honor, child," Griselda replied. "Some promises are worth keeping, regardless of how long the waiting requires." Elena carried the pendant with her always after that day, a quiet reminder of her mother's love and the truth of her own worth, one that no accusation, no cruelty, and no ancient fear could ever again take from her. Over the following weeks, Elena returned to Griselda's cottage several times, learning through patient practice and quiet meditation to recognize the subtle warmth that preceded her ability's awakening, understanding gradually how to remain calm, even when that warmth stirred within her, rather than allowing panic to summon it uncontrolled. The lessons proved slow and sometimes frustrating, but Elena found a strange comfort in the process, a growing understanding of herself that had nothing to do with the selection's competitive pressures, and everything to do with simply knowing who she truly was, beneath the fear and uncertainty that had shaped so much of her life until now. Damien often accompanied her partway on these visits, though he respected Griselda's insistence that Elena's lessons required privacy to properly take root. During the quiet walks back toward the palace afterward, their conversations deepened further, moving beyond the careful formality that had once defined their interactions, toward something far more comfortable and genuine. "I used to be afraid of what happened that day at the training grounds," Elena admitted during one such walk, the autumn leaves crunching softly beneath their steps. "Now I am beginning to understand it as simply another part of who I am, rather than something frightening I must hide or suppress." Damien glanced at her with quiet pride. That understanding alone speaks to a strength most people never develop, regardless of what abilities they may or may not carry within their blood. Elena smiled at his words, though a flicker of worry crossed her expression moments later. "And yet Duke Alaric remains under house arrest rather than facing full consequence for what he attempted," she said. "Does that trouble you, knowing he still believes my very existence threatens this kingdom?" Damien's jaw tightened slightly at the reminder. "It troubles me greatly," he admitted. "But the council insisted on due process before rendering permanent judgment, and I have agreed to respect that process, however frustrating the delay may feel. Whatever consequence eventually comes, I promise you it will be thorough, and it will reflect the seriousness of what he attempted against you." Elena nodded, trusting his assurance even as quiet unease lingered somewhere beneath her growing confidence. She had learned, through hard experience, that danger rarely announced itself clearly before arriving, and something told her that Duke Alaric's schemes, however contained for the moment, might not yet be entirely finished unfolding. Meanwhile, within the Ashwood territory, Nora found herself increasingly troubled by her mother's plans to attend the upcoming gathering, meant to introduce candidates' families to the royal court. Unlike Clara and Grace, whose primary concern remained salvaging whatever social standing they could recover through association with Elena's unexpected success, Nora had begun quietly questioning the fairness of everything that had happened to her stepsister, memories of Elena's kindness during their shared childhood, surfacing uncomfortably alongside the guilt she had long suppressed regarding her family's treatment of her. Late one evening, unable to silence her conscience any longer, Nora composed a private letter to Elena, delivered discreetly, through a trusted messenger, rather than through her mother's official channels. In it, she confessed her growing unease about Clara's intentions, warning Elena gently that their mother planned to arrive at the gathering, with hopes of positioning the family favorably, regardless of the truth behind Elena's original expulsion, and admitting quietly her own long-buried regret for never once speaking up in Elena's defense during those difficult years. Elena read the letter alone in her chamber, torn between lingering resentment and a cautious, uncertain hope that perhaps not everyone within her former household had lost the capacity for genuine remorse. She did not respond immediately, uncertain what reply might properly address years of complicated hurt, but she kept the letter carefully, its honesty offering a small measure of preparation for whatever confrontation awaited during the gathering still weeks away. The final weeks of the selection brought a formal gathering, meant to introduce the remaining candidates' families to the royal court, a tradition intended to demonstrate the alliances and support each candidate carried into a potential marriage. Elena had no noble family to present, a fact that had troubled Margaret considerably in the days leading up to the event, though Damien had assured them both privately that the absence of noble relations would not diminish Elena's standing in his eyes. What neither of them anticipated was those to arrive uninvited. Clara arrived at the palace gates on the morning of the gathering, dressed in her finest gown, Nora and Grace flanking her with expressions of forced pleasantness that did little to hide their obvious discomfort. Word of Elena's unexpected success within the selection had reached the Ashwood territory weeks earlier, and Clara, ever calculating, had decided that whatever shame she once believed Elena's presence might bring, the potential benefits of reconciling with a possible future queen far outweighed her earlier fury over the missing bracelet. Elena's stomach twisted with dread the moment she spotted her stepmother's familiar figure among the gathered guests in the grand hall. Clara's painted smile already turned toward her with an expression of practiced warmth that fooled absolutely no one who understood the family's true history. "Elena, darling," Clara said, loudly enough for nearby nobles to hear, approaching with arms extended, as though greeting a beloved daughter, rather than a girl she had thrown out into freezing cold weeks earlier. "We have missed you terribly. When we heard of your success here, we simply could not stay away any longer." Elena's jaw tightened, though she forced herself to remain composed under the watchful eyes of the surrounding court. "You threw me out in the middle of winter," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath her calm exterior. "You accused me of theft and left me to freeze outside your door." Clara's smile faltered only slightly, quickly recovering with practiced grace. "That was a misunderstanding, born from grief and confusion during a difficult time. Surely you can forgive a mother's momentary lapse in judgment, especially now that you have found such wonderful fortune here." "You are not my mother," Elena said, her voice carrying just enough conviction that several nearby guests turned to observe the exchange with growing interest. "My mother died when I was a child, and nothing you have done since has ever come close to earning that title." Nora stepped forward quickly, attempting to smooth over the increasingly tense exchange before it drew further attention. "Elena, please. We only wish to celebrate your success alongside you. Whatever happened before does not need to define us now." Elena studied her stepsister carefully, something in Nora's overly hasty attempt at reconciliation striking her as more calculated than genuine. Before she could respond further, however, a familiar voice cut through the gathering crowd, calm but carrying unmistakable authority. "Perhaps," Damien said, arriving at Elena's side with quiet but deliberate purpose, "we should finally address the accusation that led to Elena's expulsion in the first place, given that it has clearly followed her here regardless of anyone's wish to move past it quietly." Clara's composure faltered visibly for the first time. "Your Majesty, that matter was simply a private family concern, nothing that need concern the court. A missing bracelet accused against an innocent woman, leading to her being cast out into freezing weather the night before a royal selection, seems very much a matter deserving proper attention," Damien said, his tone remaining calm, but leaving no room for dismissal, especially given that the accusation nearly cost Elena her life. The surrounding court had fallen mostly silent now, nobles and guests alike drawn into the unfolding confrontation with obvious fascination. Edward, standing nearby, stepped forward with quiet efficiency, producing a small folded letter from within his coat. "Your Majesty, if I may," Edward said, having anticipated exactly this possibility once he learned Clara's family intended to attend the gathering. "I took the liberty of investigating the matter following Elena's account of the accusation. A jeweler within the Ashwood territory confirmed that a bracelet matching the described item was sold several weeks before the alleged theft occurred. Sold not by Elena, but by another member of the household." All eyes turned toward Grace, whose face had gone noticeably pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. "Grace," Clara said sharply, her earlier composure completely abandoned now. "What is he talking about?" Grace's hands trembled as the weight of every gathered gaze settled upon her. "I needed money," she admitted finally, her voice barely audible. "I sold the bracelet to pay a debt I did not want you to discover. When it went missing, and you assumed Elena had taken it, I said nothing, because admitting the truth would have meant admitting my own mistake." Clara stared at her daughter with a mixture of shock and disbelief, though whether her distress came from genuine remorse over the injustice done to Elena, or simple embarrassment at being caught in her own household's deception, Elena could not easily determine. "You let me believe she was a thief," Clara said, her voice tight with anger, directed now toward Grace rather than Elena. "You let me throw her out into the cold over a lie you allowed to stand." "I am sorry," Grace whispered, tears finally spilling down her cheeks, though the apology felt hollow given how long she had allowed the deception to continue, and how close it had come to costing Elena her life entirely. The gathered court murmured with a mixture of shock and quiet judgment, Clara's earlier attempt at reconciliation, now thoroughly undermined by the public revelation of her family's deception. Elena, standing quietly amid the unfolding scene, felt an unexpected calm settle over her, the truth finally exposed, after weeks of carrying an injustice she had never deserved. I do not need an apology anymore, Elena said finally, addressing Clara directly, her voice steady, despite the emotion of the moment. I have found something here far more valuable than anything your household ever offered me. I only wish you had chosen honesty when it might have mattered, rather than convenience now that it benefits you. Clara had no response to offer, her earlier confidence completely dismantled before the entire watching court. Damien, sensing the confrontation had reached its natural conclusion, gestured quietly for guards to escort Clara and her daughters from the palace grounds, their attendance at the gathering no longer welcome given the circumstances now fully revealed. As the guards led the visibly shaken family away, Elena turned to find Damien watching her with quiet pride, along with something warmer that had grown steadily between them over the preceding weeks. Thank you, Elena said softly, for believing me from the very beginning, long before any of this could be proven. I never needed proof to recognize honesty, Damien replied gently. I only needed to look at you, that very first night, to understand you deserved far better than what the world had given you until then. The gathered court, having witnessed the dramatic unraveling of Clara's household deception, now regarded Elena with a newfound respect that had nothing to do with noble bloodlines or political alliances, and everything to do with the quiet strength she had demonstrated throughout weeks of hardship and unwarranted suspicion. Whatever remained of the selection's final trials, Elena faced them now with a confidence she had never possessed before arriving at the palace gates on that freezing night weeks earlier, a confidence rooted not in the approval of others, but in the simple, hard-won knowledge of her own worth. In the quiet days following Clara's public humiliation, Elena found herself reflecting often on how differently her life had unfolded compared to everything she had once imagined for herself. She had never dared hope for kindness, let alone the deepening affection now growing steadily between herself and the king who had once been nothing more than a distant, intimidating figure spoken of only in cautious village whispers. One evening, as autumn gave way fully to the first true chill of winter, Damien invited her to walk with him through a quieter section of the palace she had not yet visited, a modest gallery lined with portraits of his family stretching back several generations. He paused before a painting of a stern-looking woman with golden eyes, remarkably similar to his own, her expression carrying a warmth the artist had captured despite her otherwise formal posture. My mother, Damien explained quietly, noticing Elena's curious gaze lingering on the portrait. She died when I was young, much as yours did. My father never fully recovered from the loss, and I think, looking back, that some of his sternness toward me afterward came from grief he never learned how to properly carry. Elena studied the portrait with quiet sympathy. I am sorry. I did not realize we shared that particular hardship as well. Perhaps that is part of why I understood you so immediately. That first night, Damien admitted. I recognized something in your exhaustion, your resilience, that reminded me of navigating my own losses without anyone fully prepared to guide me through them. They continued walking through the gallery, Damien sharing small fragments of his childhood Elena had never known, stories of a boy who had been thrust into significant responsibility long before he felt ready, who had learned early that trust was a rare and precious thing, rarely offered freely by those surrounding a future king. Elena listened with genuine interest, understanding him more completely with each shared memory, the careful formality that had once defined their relationship continuing to soften into something built on mutual understanding, rather than simple obligation. I used to believe love was a luxury kings could not properly afford, Damien admitted quietly as they paused near the gallery's far window, looking out over the darkening palace grounds below. Edward always insisted duty and personal feeling belonged in separate categories, and for years I believed him entirely. And now, Elena asked softly, watching him carefully. Now, Damien said, turning to face her directly, his expression carrying a vulnerability she had rarely witnessed from him before. I am beginning to understand that genuine partnership, built on trust and honesty rather than calculated convenience, might offer this kingdom something far more valuable than any carefully negotiated alliance ever could. Elena's heart warmed at his words, though she remained gently practical, even amid the growing tenderness of the moment. The council will still resist that idea, she said. Edward himself has spent years believing otherwise. Then we will simply have to help him understand differently, Damien said, a small smile finally breaking through his earlier seriousness. Together, if you are willing to help me convince him. Elena laughed softly. some of the day's heaviness finally lifting. I imagine convincing Edward of anything requires considerable patience. More than you might expect, Damien agreed, though there is nothing about this particular journey I would trade for an easier path instead. Their quiet conversation continued as evening deepened into night, the gallery's portraits watching silently over two people, gradually building something neither had expected to find within the formal, often lonely walls of royal duty. By the time Elena finally returned to her own chamber that night, she carried with her a warmth that had little to do with the fires kept burning steadily throughout the palace's many hearths, and everything to do with the growing certainty that whatever challenges still awaited them, she no longer faced the uncertainty of her future entirely alone. Despite the dramatic revelations at the gathering, the selection's political pressures did not simply disappear. 2 days later, Edward requested a formal council session, gathering the kingdom's most influential advisors within the palace's largest meeting chamber, to discuss the process moving toward its conclusion. Damien attended with quiet resolve, already anticipating the resistance he expected to face regarding his growing preference for Elena over candidates carrying more traditional political value. "Your Majesty," one council member began, once formalities concluded, "we understand recent events have shifted public sentiment considerably in Elena Voss's favor. However, the kingdom's stability depends on alliances this selection was specifically designed to secure. The Ashford family controls significant resources along our eastern border. The Whitmore family maintains critical trade relationships with the northern territories. Choosing a queen without established political connections carries risks this council cannot responsibly ignore." Damien listened patiently before responding, his tone measured but firm. "I understand the concerns regarding stability," he said, "but I would remind this council that Elena Voss carries a bloodline connection older and arguably more significant than any political alliance currently under consideration. A connection this very council once believed extinct and now must reckon with directly." Another advisor, an older woman named Countess Beaumont who had served on the council for decades, spoke up thoughtfully. "Your Majesty, the historical significance of her lineage is not in question, but bloodline alone does not guarantee the practical alliances this kingdom requires to remain secure against external threats." "Then let us discuss practicality honestly," Damien said. "Elena has demonstrated fairness, resilience, and judgment throughout every trial of this selection, qualities directly relevant to the responsibilities of ruling this kingdom. She has survived hardship most of the other candidates have never faced, and she has done so with an integrity I have not witnessed matched by any other candidate present, regardless of their family's resources or connections." The council chamber fell into thoughtful silence, several members exchanging quiet glances as they considered the king's unusually direct defense of a candidate they had initially dismissed as an inconsequential distraction from the selection's true purpose. Edward, who had remained quiet throughout much of the discussion, finally spoke, his earlier skepticism regarding Elena now considerably softened by weeks of observing her conduct firsthand. "If I may offer my own assessment," he said, drawing the attention of his fellow council members. "When I first learned of Elena's inclusion in this selection, I shared many of the concerns raised here today. However, having observed her conduct closely over these past weeks, including her handling of considerable adversity and danger, I believe she possesses exactly the qualities this kingdom needs in its next queen, regardless of the political convenience other candidates might offer." The unexpected support from his most trusted advisor carried significant weight within the chamber, several council members visibly reconsidering their positions in light of Edward's assessment. Discussion continued for some time longer, weighing practical concerns against the growing recognition that Elena's unique combination of character and lineage offered the kingdom something valuable beyond simple political convenience. By the session's conclusion, though full consensus had not been reached, Damien made clear his intention to proceed according to his own judgment regarding the selection's outcome, while remaining open to addressing legitimate concerns about alliance and stability through other diplomatic means available to the crown. That evening, as Damien shared the details of the council session with Elena during one of their now regular private conversations, she listened with a mixture of gratitude and lingering uncertainty about her own place within such significant decisions. "I do not wish to cause conflict within your council," Elena said carefully. "If choosing me creates lasting difficulty for your kingdom's stability, perhaps the wiser choice would be one that serves practical needs more directly." Damien shook his head firmly. "Elena, A kingdom's stability depends on more than alliances recorded in formal agreements. It depends on trust between a ruler and the people he serves, and I have watched you demonstrate exactly the kind of character that earns genuine trust, not through manipulation or calculated positioning, but through simple, consistent honesty, even when it cost you comfort or safety. Elena's eyes softened at his words, though she pressed further, wanting to understand fully, before allowing herself to hope too completely. "And the alliances the council worries about?" she asked. "What happens to those concerns if you choose me instead?" "There are other ways to secure alliances beyond marriage alone," Damien said. "Trade agreements, diplomatic exchanges, mutual defense arrangements negotiated on their own merit rather than tied to a single marriage decision. I do not intend to ignore this kingdom's practical needs, Elena. I simply refuse to believe those needs require sacrificing genuine partnership for the sake of political convenience alone." Their conversation continued late into the evening, the weight of the coming days settling gently between them alongside a growing certainty neither felt the need to rush toward completion. The selection's final trial approached, one last formal test meant to determine, alongside Damien's personal judgment, which candidate would ultimately be presented to the kingdom as its next queen. The following week brought the selection's concluding trial, a formal audience before the full royal court, where each remaining candidate would present their vision for the kingdom's future, demonstrating not only their personal qualities, but their understanding of the responsibilities awaiting whoever ultimately claimed the crown alongside Damien. Vivian, having distanced herself entirely from Duke Alaric's schemes following her earlier confession, approached the trial with humble determination, her presentation focusing on strengthening border security and expanding trade opportunities for the eastern territories she represented. Her words carried genuine competence, though something had shifted in her demeanor since the forest incident, a quieter thoughtfulness replacing her earlier arrogant confidence. Other remaining candidates offered their own presentations, each competent in their own right, discussing agricultural improvements, military strategy, and diplomatic relationships with neighboring kingdoms. The court listened attentively to each presentation, though murmurs of anticipation grew steadily as the schedule approached Elena's turn to speak. When Elena finally stepped forward to address the gathered court, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that had grown steadily throughout the weeks of the selection, though nervousness still fluttered gently beneath her composed exterior as she faced the assembled nobles and advisors, who would judge her worthiness, alongside candidates far more experienced in matters of governance and politics. "I do not have years of noble training to draw upon," Elena began, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "I cannot speak with the same authority about trade agreements or military strategy that other candidates have studied their entire lives. What I can offer is an understanding of what it means to be overlooked, to be judged unfairly, to survive without the protection others take for granted." She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing, her eyes moving across the gathered faces, watching her intently. "This kingdom is not built only from noble houses and wealthy alliances," she continued. "It is built from ordinary people working fields, raising families, surviving hardship most of this court has never personally experienced. A ruler who understands that struggle, who has lived it directly rather than only heard about it from advisors and reports, brings something valuable to this crown that no political alliance alone can provide. I do not offer wealth or established connections. I offer the perspective of someone who has walked among the very people this kingdom depends upon most, and who understands, firsthand, what fairness and genuine care actually require." The hall remained quiet for a long moment after she finished speaking, before a murmur of genuine appreciation began spreading through the gathered court, several nobles nodding thoughtfully at the unexpected depth of her presentation. Even Countess Beaumont, who had raised pointed concerns during the earlier council session, appeared visibly moved by the sincerity of Elena's words. Damien, seated at the head of the hall throughout each presentation, felt his earlier certainty solidify completely as Elena concluded her address, any lingering doubt about his decision now fully resolved. Whatever political complications remained to be navigated, he understood with complete clarity that the choice before him was no longer a difficult one at all. As the final trial concluded and the candidates were dismissed to await the selection's ultimate outcome, whispers already began circulating throughout the palace regarding which candidate the king would ultimately choose, though only Damien himself knew with absolute certainty the decision that awaited formal announcement in the days ahead. In the days between the final trial and the formal announcement awaiting the entire kingdom, Damien surprised Elena with an unusual request, inviting her to accompany him on a quiet journey beyond the palace walls, away from the watchful eyes of court and council alike. Dressed in simple traveling clothes rather than the elaborate gowns she had grown accustomed to wearing within the palace, Elena joined him early one morning as they set out toward a small village nestled along the kingdom's northern border, accompanied only by a modest escort of trusted guards, who understood the importance of discretion. "Why here?" Elena asked, as their carriage approached the modest village, its narrow streets and simple cottages reminding her strongly of the Ashwood territory she had once called home. "I want you to see this kingdom the way its people actually experience it," Damien explained, "before you take on the full weight of ruling beside me. Councils and formal reports tell only part of the story. I find myself learning far more from simply walking among the people whose lives our decisions ultimately shape." They spent the day moving quietly through the village, Damien dressed plainly enough that only a few sharp-eyed villagers recognized him, and even those who did maintained a respectful distance rather than drawing unwanted attention toward the visit. Elena found herself speaking easily with the local families, her own experience of hardship allowing her to connect genuinely with concerns that might have otherwise gone unheard within the formal channels of palace governance. An elderly farmer named Edmund shared his worries about the difficulty of transporting goods along roads left poorly maintained since his grandfather's time, explaining patiently how the added cost of damaged carts and lost time cut deeply into already thin profits. A young mother named Lily, balancing a child on her hip while tending a small vegetable stall, spoke quietly about the challenges facing Omegas within the village, who lacked proper protection under local pack law, issues Elena recognized immediately from her own years of vulnerability within Clara's household. Elena listened carefully to each conversation, asking thoughtful questions and committing important details to memory, understanding instinctively that genuine governance required listening first, long before any policy could be properly designed to address real needs, rather than assumptions made from the comfortable distance of palace walls. As the afternoon light began to soften, Damien and Elena found a quiet spot near the village's edge, overlooking fields stretching toward the horizon, the kind of ordinary beauty that rarely earned mention within formal court proceedings, but meant everything to the people who depended upon that land for their survival. "You handled that beautifully," Damien said, watching her with quiet admiration as they rested briefly before beginning their journey back toward the capital. Most nobles visiting a village like this offer polite nods and empty promises. You offered genuine attention, and they could feel the difference immediately. "I know what it feels like to be unheard," Elena said simply. "I do not intend to become someone who makes others feel that way, regardless of what crown I eventually wear." "That," Damien said, reaching for her hand gently, "is exactly why I have never doubted my choice, not for a single moment since that very first cold night." Their journey back to the capital that evening carried a quiet contentment neither had expected from what began as a simple visit, both of them understanding more completely now the shared vision they hoped to build together as king and queen, one rooted not in distant privilege, but in genuine understanding of the people they would soon serve for the remainder of their lives. The morning of the selection's formal announcement arrived beneath a clear autumn sky, sunlight streaming through the grand hall's tall windows and casting warm light across the assembled court. Nobles from every corner of the kingdom had gathered for the occasion, along with representatives from allied territories, eager to witness the conclusion of a tradition that would shape the kingdom's future for years to come. Elena stood among the remaining candidates near the front of the hall, dressed in a simple gown of deep green that Margaret had helped her select that morning, her nerves steady despite the significance of the moment awaiting her. She had made peace, over the preceding days, with whatever outcome awaited, understanding that regardless of Damien's final decision, she had already gained something invaluable through this journey, a sense of her own worth that no one could take from her again. Before the formal announcement could proceed, however, an unexpected disturbance arose near the hall's entrance, drawing startled murmurs from the gathered crowd. A messenger arrived breathlessly, requesting urgent audience with the king regarding a matter connected to Duke Alaric, whose house arrest had apparently not prevented him from attempting one final act of desperate defiance. "Your Majesty," the messenger said once granted permission to approach, "forgive the interruption. but Duke Alaric has sent a formal letter to be read before the full court, insisting on his right to address these proceedings, given his family's historical connection to matters concerning the old bloodline. Damien's expression tightened slightly, though he gestured for the letter to be brought forward, unwilling to allow suspicion or unresolved grievance to overshadow the day's proceedings without proper address. The letter, read aloud by a palace official, contained Duke Alaric's continued insistence that Elena's lineage posed inherent danger to the kingdom's stability, urging the court to reconsider any decision that might place someone of the first blood lineage in a position of significant power. A tense silence settled over the hall as the letter's contents finished being read, several nobles exchanging uncertain glances, old fears about ancient conflicts stirring uncomfortably beneath the formal proceedings of the day. Damien rose from his seat, addressing the gathered court directly, rather than allowing the letter's implications to fester unanswered. "I have consulted the most complete historical records available regarding the lineage in question," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "Duke Alaric's fears are rooted in incomplete understanding of events generations past, a conflict born from misunderstanding, rather than any inherent danger within the bloodline itself. I will not allow old fears, however sincerely held, to overshadow the genuine character and integrity I have witnessed demonstrated repeatedly throughout this selection." He paused, his gaze moving deliberately across the gathered court, before settling on Elena, who stood watching him with quiet, steady composure, despite the weight of the moment. "Furthermore," Damien continued, "Duke Alaric's own actions during this selection, including a deliberate attempt to endanger a candidate's life through sabotage, demonstrate far more genuine threat to this kingdom's stability than anything connected to ancient bloodlines, long since resolved through the passage of time. His continued attempts to influence these proceedings from house arrest will be addressed through appropriate legal consequence following today's conclusion." The court murmured with a mixture of understanding and lingering unease, though Damien's firm handling of the interruption left little room for further challenge to the day's proceedings. With the matter formally addressed, he turned his full attention back toward the gathered candidates, ready finally to deliver the announcement the entire kingdom had been anticipating for weeks. "I have spent these past weeks observing each of you carefully," Damien began, addressing the remaining candidates directly. "I have watched you face trials designed to test not only your capability, but your character, your integrity, and your genuine understanding of what this crown requires from whoever stands beside it. Each of you brought something valuable to this process, and I do not make this decision lightly, nor without genuine respect for every candidate who participated with honesty and dedication." He paused, his gaze finding Elena once more, and something in his expression softened noticeably, a warmth that had grown steadily throughout the weeks since that first freezing night when he had found her collapsed upon his palace steps. "There is one candidate among you, however, who arrived at this selection through circumstances none of us could have anticipated," Damien continued. "She came to these walls not through noble invitation, but through desperate necessity, cast aside by those who should have protected her, left with nothing but the strength of her own character to carry her forward. Throughout every trial since, she has demonstrated honesty when deception would have been easier, courage when fear would have been understandable, and genuine care for others, even when circumstances gave her every reason to focus only on her own survival." The hall had grown completely silent now, every eye fixed on Damien as he continued, his voice carrying quiet conviction that left no doubt regarding the direction of his announcement. "I do not choose my future queen today based on wealth, or political alliance, or noble bloodline alone," Damien said. "I choose her because she has shown me, repeatedly and without hesitation, exactly the kind of strength and integrity this kingdom deserves from whoever rules beside me. Elena Voss, will you step forward?" Elena's heart pounded as she moved forward from among the gathered candidates, the weight of every watching eye settling upon her as she approached the raised platform where Damien stood waiting, his golden eyes carrying an unmistakable warmth that steadied her trembling nerves considerably. "Elena Voss," Damien said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall as he took her hand gently in his own. "From the very first night I found you, I recognized something within you that no political calculation could ever replicate, an honesty and strength that has only grown more evident with each passing day since. I am asking you now, before this entire court, not simply to accept a crown, but to stand beside me as my equal partner in ruling this kingdom. sharing both its burdens and its blessings, for as long as we both shall live. Elena's eyes filled with tears. She made no effort to hide the weight of everything she had endured, to arrive at this moment, finally settling into something resembling peace. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion coursing through her. "I will stand beside you, Damien, not because of the crown, but because of everything I have come to understand about you these past weeks, and everything I hope we might build together for this kingdom, and for each other." The hall erupted into applause, nobles and commoners alike, who had gathered to witness the announcement, celebrating the unexpected conclusion of a selection that had begun with such uncertain circumstances weeks earlier. Nora, who had remained in the kingdom despite her mother's public disgrace, watched from among the gathered crowd with an expression that carried genuine, if belated, respect for the stepsister she had once dismissed so casually. As the celebration continued around them, Damien drew Elena close, his voice dropping to something meant only for her ears, amid the surrounding noise and joy. "I told you, that very first morning, that I would not let you disappear back into whatever darkness had cast you out," he said quietly. "I never imagined, then, how completely you would come to fill the light in this palace instead." Elena smiled through her tears, the weight of that freezing night, weeks earlier, finally settling into something she could look back upon, not with pain, but with quiet gratitude, for the unlikely path that had led her exactly here, to this moment, standing beside a king who had chosen her not out of pity or convenience, but out of genuine, hard-won love. The weeks following the formal announcement passed in a flurry of preparation, as the palace transformed itself once more, this time not for the tense competition of the selection, but for the joyous celebration of a royal wedding and coronation that would soon follow. Elena found herself swept into an entirely new rhythm of life, one filled with lessons in governance, careful introductions to visiting dignitaries, and the gradual process of learning what it truly meant to stand beside a king as his equal partner, rather than simply his chosen bride. Margaret remained close throughout this transition, her steady presence offering Elena comfort during moments when the weight of her new position felt overwhelming. "You have already proven yourself capable of far more than most nobles born into privilege ever demonstrate," Margaret reminded her gently one afternoon, as Elena struggled through a particularly dense lesson regarding the kingdom's trade agreements with northern territories. "Do not let unfamiliarity with formal governance convince you that you do not belong exactly where you now stand." Elena took the words to heart, applying the same determination that had carried her through the selection's trials toward mastering the responsibilities now awaiting her as future queen. Edward, whose earlier skepticism had transformed into genuine respect and support, personally oversaw much of her education regarding matters of state, his patient guidance revealing a kindness beneath his formal exterior that Elena had not fully appreciated during the selection itself. Vivian, having distanced herself entirely from Duke Alaric's schemes and demonstrated genuine remorse for her earlier actions, remained within the palace at Elena's own gracious request, her considerable political knowledge proving valuable as an advisor regarding matters of the Eastern Territories she had grown up understanding intimately. The friendship that gradually developed between the two women surprised them both, forged through shared hardship and mutual respect, earned rather than assumed. "I never expected to consider you a friend," Vivian admitted one evening as the two women reviewed diplomatic correspondence together within Elena's growing study. "I saw you only as competition to be eliminated, rather than someone whose strength I might come to genuinely admire." Elena smiled warmly at the admission, no trace of lingering resentment coloring her response. "We were both placed into circumstances neither of us fully chose, competing for something that ultimately mattered far less than the understanding we eventually found in each other. I am simply glad we found our way past that difficult beginning." Duke Alaric's formal trial concluded during this same period, the council determining that his deliberate endangerment of Elena's life during the Forest trial, combined with his attempts to influence the selection's outcome through fear and manipulation, warranted permanent removal from his position and lasting exile from the capital territory. Though some among the older nobility quietly sympathized with his stated fears regarding the ancient bloodline, the overwhelming consensus recognized that his actions had crossed far beyond acceptable concern into genuine attempted harm, consequences he would now bear for the remainder of his days. As winter approached and the kingdom settled into anticipation of the upcoming coronation, Elena found herself increasingly comfortable within her new role, though quiet moments of reflection still occasionally carried her back to memories of the freezing night that had begun this entire unlikely journey. She often found herself standing near the very palace steps where Damien had first discovered her, the stone now warmed by careful maintenance, and softened in her memory by everything that had followed since that desperate, uncertain evening. One such evening, as snow began to fall gently outside the palace windows, Damien found her there again, standing quietly near those same steps, wrapped now in a warm cloak, far different from the thin dress that had offered no protection against that first bitter winter night. "You return here often," Damien observed, coming to stand beside her, his presence warm against the gentle chill of the evening air. Elena nodded thoughtfully, watching snowflakes settle softly onto the stone steps below. "I suppose I like remembering how far I have come," she said. "It would be easy to forget, surrounded now by comfort and security, just how uncertain everything once felt. I do not want to forget that uncertainty entirely. It shaped who I became, and who I hope to remain, even as queen." Damien studied her with quiet admiration, understanding completely the wisdom behind her words. "Then let us remember together," he said, taking her hand gently in his own. "Whatever comfort this crown provides, let us never forget the people still facing uncertainty and hardship beyond these walls, the way you once did yourself." Elena squeezed his hand in quiet agreement, the weight of that shared understanding settling comfortably between them, as snow continued falling gently around the palace steps that had first brought them together weeks earlier, under such different, desperate circumstances. In the final days leading up to the coronation, Margaret took charge of preparing Elena for the significant ceremony ahead, her steady presence offering comfort amid the flurry of fittings, rehearsals, and formal instruction that filled Elena's days almost entirely. One quiet evening, as Margaret carefully adjusted the hem of the gown Elena would wear during the ceremony, Elena found herself curious about the older woman who had shown her such consistent kindness since that very first freezing morning weeks earlier. "You have served this palace for many years," Elena observed gently, watching Margaret work with practiced precision. "Have you always found such purpose in caring for others here?" Margaret paused thoughtfully before answering, her hands stilling momentarily against the fabric. "I came to this palace as a young woman myself," she admitted, "under circumstances not entirely unlike your own. My family could not support me, and I arrived here with nothing beyond a willingness to work hard and prove my worth through service rather than status." Elena's eyes widened slightly at the unexpected revelation. "I did not know that." "Few do," Margaret said with a small, knowing smile. "It is not a story I share often, though watching you these past months has reminded me considerably of the young woman I once was myself, uncertain of her place in a world that seemed determined to overlook her entirely." "What changed for you?" Elena asked, genuinely curious. "I found purpose in caring for others, exactly as you asked," Margaret said. "The old queen, Damien's mother, showed me great kindness during my early years here, teaching me that a person's value has nothing to do with the family name they carry, and everything to do with the character they choose to build, regardless of circumstance. I have tried to pass that same lesson forward to every young woman who has crossed my path since, though few have embraced it as fully as you have." Elena felt tears prick at her eyes, moved deeply by the quiet parallel between their two stories, separated by decades, but united by a similar journey from uncertainty toward genuine belonging. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything you have done to help me find my way here." Margaret's own eyes grew misty as she returned to her work, though her voice remained steady. "Thank you for reminding an old woman that kindness, offered freely without expectation, still finds its way toward those who need it most, exactly as it once found its way toward me." They continued their quiet work together as evening deepened outside the chamber's windows, the bond between them settling into something closer to family than simple service, a relationship that would remain steady throughout all the years of Elena's reign that followed, Margaret serving as a trusted confidant long after the formal duties of preparing a new queen for her coronation had concluded. The night before the ceremony, Elena found herself unable to sleep, nervous energy keeping her awake long after the palace had settled into quiet darkness around her. She rose from her bed and moved toward the window, looking out over the same gardens where she had first spoken privately with Damien so many months earlier, marveling quietly at how completely her circumstances had transformed since that desperate winter night. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts, and she opened her chamber door to find Damien standing there, similarly unable to sleep, his expression carrying the same nervous anticipation she herself felt. "I know this is not entirely proper. The night before our formal ceremony," he admitted with a small, sheepish smile. "But I found I could not settle my thoughts without seeing you first." Elena smiled warmly, stepping aside to allow him entry, though they remained near the doorway rather than venturing further into the private space of her chamber. "I am glad you came," she said honestly. "I find myself equally unable to rest." They spoke quietly for a while, neither discussing anything of particular significance, simply enjoying the comfort of each other's presence on the eve of the significant change awaiting them both. Whatever nerves lingered regarding tomorrow's formal responsibilities, the quiet certainty of their partnership steadied them both considerably, before Damien finally returned to his own chamber, leaving Elena to find peaceful sleep at last, her heart full of quiet anticipation for the life awaiting her with the coming dawn. The coronation itself arrived on a clear winter morning weeks later, the entire capital gathering, to witness the formal ceremony that would establish Elena as queen alongside Damien's continued reign as Alpha King. The grand hall, decorated elaborately for the occasion, with banners bearing both the traditional Ashgrave crest and a newly incorporated symbol representing the ancient First Blood lineage, buzzed with excited anticipation, as nobles, commoners, and dignitaries from allied territories filled every available space to witness the historic ceremony. Elena stood at the entrance of the hall, dressed in a gown of deep silver and blue, her copper hair adorned simply with a delicate circlet that Margaret had helped select, understanding intuitively that elaborate ornamentation would only distract from the quiet strength Elena carried within herself, regardless of outward decoration. As the ceremonial music began, she walked forward through the parting crowd, her steps steady despite the significance of the moment awaiting her at the hall's far end. Damien waited for her there, dressed in formal royal attire, his expression carrying a warmth that had nothing to do with ceremonial requirement, and everything to do with genuine love that had grown steadily since that first uncertain morning weeks earlier. As Elena reached him, taking her place beside him before the assembled court, the kingdom's high priestess stepped forward to begin the formal coronation ritual that would bind their partnership officially before both the gathered nobility and the ancient traditions of the crown itself. The ceremony proceeded with solemn dignity, vows exchanged that spoke not only of partnership between king and queen, but of mutual commitment to serving the kingdom's people with fairness, honesty, and genuine care regardless of status or circumstance. When the priestess finally placed the ceremonial crown gently upon Elena's head, formally declaring her Queen Elena Ashgrave before the entire assembled court, the hall erupted into celebration that carried far beyond the palace walls into the streets of the capital itself, where common folk gathered to celebrate a queen who had risen from among their own ranks, rather than descending from distant noble privilege. As the celebration continued long into that winter evening, Elena found a quiet moment to slip away toward the palace gardens, drawn once more toward the memory of everything that had led her to this remarkable point in her life. Damien found her there eventually, as he so often did now, and together they stood beneath the winter stars, the weight of the crown settling comfortably upon Elena's shoulders, alongside the deep, hard-won happiness she had found within these once unfamiliar walls. Among the celebrating crowd that evening stood Nora, who had traveled to the capital alone despite her mother's continued disgrace, uncertain whether she would even be permitted entry into the coronation, given her family's tarnished standing. Elena, remembering the quiet honesty of the letter Nora had sent weeks earlier warning her of Clara's intentions, had personally ensured her stepsister received a formal invitation, understanding that genuine remorse deserved a chance at reconciliation, however imperfect the path toward it might prove. Following the ceremony, as the grand hall settled into quieter celebration, Elena sought Nora out among the dispersing crowd, finding her standing somewhat apart from the festivities, uncertain of her welcome despite the invitation extended to her. "I did not expect you to invite me," Nora admitted quietly as Elena approached, her earlier confidence entirely absent, replaced by a humility Elena had never witnessed from her stepsister before. "Your letter meant more to me than you likely realized," Elena said gently. "It could not undo everything that happened between us, but it told me that perhaps not every memory of those years needs to remain painful." Nora's eyes filled with tears she struggled to contain. "I should have defended you, all those years ago, and especially that night. I told myself I was powerless to change our mother's mind. But the truth is, I was simply too afraid of losing my own comfortable position within the household to risk speaking up on your behalf. Elena considered her stepsister's admission carefully before responding, understanding that forgiveness, while not owed to anyone, sometimes offered more peace to the one extending it than the one receiving it. I cannot pretend those years did not hurt me deeply, she said honestly, but I do not wish to carry that hurt forward into every remaining year of my life either. I would rather build something new, if you are genuinely willing to be different than the family I once knew. Nora nodded fervently, gratitude evident in every line of her expression. I would like that more than I can properly express. Over the following months, a cautious but genuine friendship began rebuilding itself between the two women, Nora eventually taking up residence within the capital and finding purpose assisting with charitable initiatives Elena established for families facing hardship similar to what she herself had once endured. Grace, still burdened by the guilt of her earlier deception, remained more distant from the reconciliation, though she too eventually sent a hesitant letter of apology that Elena chose to accept with quiet grace, understanding that not every relationship required complete restoration to find some measure of peace. Clara herself never fully recovered her earlier social standing, her household's reputation permanently marked by the public revelation of her cruelty and poor judgment. Elena, despite everything, found she harbored no desire for further punishment beyond what circumstances had already delivered, choosing instead to focus her energy on building a future rather than dwelling on a past that could not be changed, regardless of how much anger she might have justifiably carried forward. Years passed following the coronation, and the kingdom of Vermore flourished under the combined leadership of King Damien and Queen Elena, whose partnership proved exactly as valuable as Damien had once argued before his skeptical council. Elena's understanding of common hardship shaped policies that improved conditions for laborers and omegas throughout the kingdom, reforms that earned her genuine love among the common folk who had once viewed royal marriages as distant affairs, holding little relevance to their daily struggles. Her ability, once feared by figures like Duke Alaric as a dangerous unknown, gradually became understood throughout the kingdom as exactly what scholar Fenwick's ancient records had suggested it might be, a source of strength rather than destruction. Awakening on the rare occasions, genuine danger threatened the kingdom's people, always in service of protection rather than harm. Griselda, who had guided Elena's early understanding of her lineage, remained a trusted advisor to the crown until her passing many years later, having lived long enough to witness the fear surrounding the first blood lineage, finally replaced by genuine respect and gratitude throughout the kingdom. Vivian remained a close friend and trusted advisor throughout the years that followed, eventually finding her own genuine partnership with a neighboring territory's young lord, a match built on mutual respect, rather than the calculated ambition that had once defined her approach to the selection. She often remarked, in later years, that losing the selection to Elena had ultimately given her something far more valuable than a crown, a genuine friendship and a clearer understanding of the kind of person she truly wished to become. Edward, whose early skepticism toward Elena had transformed so completely into genuine admiration, served the crown faithfully until his own retirement many years later, often telling younger advisors that his greatest lesson learned during his long service came from watching a king choose genuine partnership over calculated convenience, and discovering that choice had strengthened the kingdom far beyond anything careful political alliance alone could have achieved. Duke Alaric lived out his remaining years in quiet exile, his fear of the first blood lineage never fully abandoned, though even he eventually acknowledged, in a private letter sent to the crown shortly before his passing, that Elena's rule had brought the kingdom nothing but strength and stability, a grudging admission that the ancient conflict he had feared repeating had instead resolved into something far more hopeful than the old stories had ever suggested possible. From a girl thrown out into freezing darkness with nothing but the clothes on her back, to a queen standing proudly beside the man who had first shown her genuine kindness on that desperate night, Elena's journey stood as a quiet testament to the idea that circumstances of birth or fortune mattered far less than the strength, honesty, and genuine character a person carried within themselves through even the most difficult trials life could offer. The kingdom of Vermore, in the years that followed, came to know Queen Elena not simply as a ruler chosen through unusual circumstance, but as a genuine partner to her king, one whose understanding of hardship and unwavering commitment to fairness shaped policies that benefited common folk and nobility alike. And though the memory of that freezing night on the palace steps never fully faded from either Elena or Damien's minds, it remained, for both of them, not a symbol of what had once been lost, but a quiet reminder of exactly how much could be gained when kindness, courage, and genuine love were allowed to triumph over fear, cruelty, and the circumstances life sometimes carelessly assigned. And so, in the great kingdom of Vermore, the story of the girl found sleeping on the palace steps became not merely a tale whispered among servants and nobles alike, but a lasting legend passed down through generations, a reminder that even the darkest, coldest nights sometimes lead unexpectedly toward the warmest and most extraordinary of beginnings.